Okay, I think we're all set. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us today. If you're new to our discussions, what we do here is we cover the news. We use a lot of mainstream sources, but we really try to accent that heavily using open source information, most of it drawn from great accounts right here on Twitter. In addition, we try to present tools and techniques so that whether you're new to analyzing open source info or you've been at it quite a while, hopefully you'll find something for you. We can all bring our skills up together. Finally, we like to have guests in who are doing great work in order to discuss their projects. In that way, we hope that if you discover projects that you think are interesting, you can connect with some folks and maybe we can build greater collaboration in the community. And this space relies pretty heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the Spaces window where the links to individual tweets are posted. If you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side of the nest, that's the invitation to today's space. But if you were to click on it, the thread that opens up below it contains our agenda, essentially my speaking notes. The reason I do that is so that you essentially don't have to take my word for much of what I say. I try to provide sources for just about everything. It also gives you a base that if you find something interesting, you can take it away as a starting point for further reading. Also, what you can do is look ahead in the agenda, and if a subject interests you, then you can always come up with questions or comments. In order to do that, you can request the microphone button, which is in the bottom left-hand corner of the Spaces window. And of course, we'd like to get as many people into the conversation as possible. And so if you're enjoying the conversation, please do retweet the space. You can do that with the button in the bottom right-hand corner of the Spaces window. So the way we're going to go ahead today is we have a great guest with us, Ryan Hendrickson. Just before getting to Ryan, to give people a chance to arrive in the room, for about the next 5 minutes, I'm going to run through some recent podcasts that are probably of interest to the crowd, may get into one or two resources, but then we'll turn our attention to a conversation with Ryan about demining. After we have our conversation, we'll move into updates on the war in Ukraine, and that'll probably fill out the balance of the conversation. We'll wrap up. Usually I aim for 3 hours. Often we run over by 20 to 30 minutes, but that's the plan for today. And so I'm going to start with the item that's on the far right-hand side of the nest. Once again, that's the invitation to our space, but the speaking notes are in the thread if you click through. The second item from the right is the invitation to our next discussion. I hold these talks every Thursday evening at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and every Sunday afternoon, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So you can set your reminder now. Who runs the podcast The Global Gambit, and he had on Casus Belli, who does great work, following events in Africa, particularly the involvement of Wagner there. But they discussed the recent coup in Niger. There was also an episode of a podcast called Analyze and Educate that once again had on friends of ours, Cassis Belli and John Larrier of Defense Bulletin. I haven't heard that one yet, but I'm sure it's a great discussion as well. The next set of podcasts that came out in the last few days relate to the death of Prigozhin. So the first of those is the podcast put together by Mark Galliotti in Moscow's Shadow. And so he did an episode on Prigozhin. And then a couple of the regular faces did the same. So the Foreign Office podcast by Michael Weiss. And then there was a War on the Rocks episode speaking with John Lechner, talking more about the rise of Prigozhin and his background. So if, his history is only catching your attention now, you can go and learn a little bit more about how he became so prominent. And then not on Prigozhin specifically, but there is a new episode of the Russia Contingency out, hosted by our friend Mike Kaufman. And he spoke with a Russian historian, Stephen Kotkin. And their focus was more on how to win the peace, or how to consider dynamics beyond just what's happening on the battlefield. And so that's the Russia Contingency is a paid podcast, a subscription podcast. But every month or two, they'll do portions as free samples. So there's a 45-minute portion of that particular episode that is available free. Go ahead, Exit.
Just a tiny bit of housekeeping. It appears that some people are having a few connection issues, and I did too when I first connected today. Twitter seems to be glitchy. If that's you, please go back in and out, and I think it'll solve everything for you.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's, Twitter Spaces is incredible in some ways in its ability to bring people together. But then it's also pretty heavily glitchy. As you guys will notice, I tend to develop, audio glitches from time to time, and it's frustrating, but hopefully we'll get everybody together. Okay, I think the one other thing I'll highlight is in the nest. I'll move it to the front. You might just enjoy having a look at some of the assembled maps. I usually get to it when we turn to our updates on the offensive, but it's now the first item in the nest in case any of those maps are new to you and you want to be following along as we discuss what's happening in Ukraine. Okay, that's all the material I'll get to now. I will discuss some more detailed resources and examples from the past week. I just don't want to hold up Ryan to make sure we get as much opportunity to catch up with him as possible. So Ryan Hendrickson runs an organization called the Tip of the Spear. It's a corporation, and Ryan and his group are heavily involved in demining areas of Ukraine. And of course, he's been there to do his work many times. He's planning another trip back shortly in September. And we have discussed on these talks the importance of demining, not just along the front line, but throughout the territory of Ukraine. It's going to be an immensely large project, but it's important, not only for personal safety, but also for the resumption of, farming and other normal commercial activity in Ukraine. And it's also an area where we've been getting little bits of insight here and there on the scale of it and the rate of progress, but we don't really have a comprehensive picture. So hopefully we'll get into some of those details with Ryan. So Ryan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys having me on. It's pretty excited to get on here and talk to you guys.
I know that Exit, my co-host, has been chatting with you, for a while now, and that she developed an initial set of questions. So I'll just turn it over to Exit, and we'll get into it.
Amazing. Yep.
So Ryan, I wondered, you have a giant long backstory, and I wondered if you could give us kind of the elevator pitch of who you are and how you ended up here demining in Ukraine on a regular basis, just so that you could kind of quickly introduce yourself to everybody else in the room.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, the elevator pitch. That's going to be a difficult one. Let me give it a shot. So basically, I was in the Army. Special Forces Green Beret, and I was a 18 Charlie, which is an engineer, so demolitions expert, 8 deployments to Afghanistan, a lot of experience with removing IEDs and mines. I stepped on an IED in 2010 that almost took my life, recovered from that, was able to go back to Afghanistan another 7 times. And then I started at the end, I left Afghanistan towards the beginning of July 2021. And that's when I, was just finding this very big kind of void and this lack of purpose in my life. And I've dedicated my entire military career to Afghanistan. And now what? And I know a lot of veterans that have spent time in Afghanistan, whether it's United States, Canadian, British or whatnot, Australian, they all know what I'm talking about with this. And so as I'm sitting there trying to figure out who I am and what's my purpose in life now, February 24th rolls around. So at this time I was contracting for a government contract, and I just decided within 2 weeks, I'm going to go to Ukraine. So I quit my job, headed over to Ukraine without really an idea what I was going to do. Besides, I was going to link up with a missionary organization and start evacuating people out of the suburbs at that time in March, the suburbs of Kyiv. So fast forward, the Russians start to move east, civilians start to come back into their homes, and now you're getting casualties from landmines, booby traps, and explosive war remnants. So I start off with just doing some training with the kids when we had time, when we weren't running supplies. And don't touch this. This is what this looks like. This is how you tell somebody about this. And then maybe a little bit on, hey, use this tape, put some stakes around it, tape it off, call up, at that time it was the military, but then shortly after DS&S. And it just turned into, next thing I know, I'm helping people with some training on a metal detector, a military grade metal detector. Yes, I've used that before. Afghanistan, let me show you. And then next thing I know, it's, hey, can you help us out a little bit with some training? We just got told we're sappers and we don't know what we're doing. Okay, so then one thing turned into another, which eventually led to me going back in August of 22 and helping out some sapper unit out in Kharkiv, helping them clear some fields. And eventually I came home from that, realized this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. This is what has given me that purpose. This is who Ryan Hendrickson is. I'm not, I've done my fair share of fighting. Now I'm going to do my fair share of hoping. And so came home, started up a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And then we've just been going back to Ukraine pretty much nonstop, whether it's demining, training, advising, assisting, and also equipping. We bring over equipment, train people up on it, go to the minefields with them. You're good to go. Donate the equipment over, rinse and repeat. Very long elevator ride, but that's what I got.
I think for your story, that was actually a great elevator pitch. I'm impressed that you got it down that small. Nukes, I think you have the next question here.
All right. Well, my question was, what's an average day like over there for you? That's cut and dry.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it really does depend on the day. But the average demining day for us is, so we already have our established area where we're going to work. We've done the non-technical survey, then the technical survey. We've reported everything up to DS&S. We have the green light. Now we can start removing mines, battle area clearance. And we'll get out to the minefields about 8 a.m. You don't want to be demining, when you're having obstructions of light, as in, when it's dark outside. correction, humanitarian demining when it's dark outside. And so we'll get out there and we'll start setting everything up. The beginning is medical. You need to make sure your medical platforms are in place and your primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. All of those are in place for medical. We're up on comms. Yep. We got the number to our Ukrainian counterpart who, if something goes wrong, we're going to be able to get a hold of, and they're going to be able to put everything in motion, whether it's an ambulance or you name it. Yep. Good to go. And then we just start through the motions of making it out. If this is the first time that we have encountered this field, then we sweep our first areas, which is the obvious, the parking area, the staging area, the medical area, where you're going to eat, where you're going to take a piss. All that stuff has to be swept. Once you have your actual working areas done, then you can start to infiltrate the minefield. And as you're starting to infiltrate the minefield, you're setting up your lanes. And so as you move, okay, we're going to skirt this farm field first. We're going to move up. Most likely it's going to be the tree line is going to be to one side, and we're moving up the other side of the tree line. And that will be our initial lane, and we stake it off all the way up until, okay, this will be our limit of advance. And then we'll start the next lane, and you stake off that next lane. And then it just gets, once you start finding mines, it's a lot of fun. But before then, yeah, it's slow, and it's not sexy. It's boring, but it's necessary. The lanes are necessary, not for me, but if I got injured, the medics need to see where the cleared areas are. So that's pretty much just very, again, it depends on the day, but it's just very methodical, and it's very structured, and at times, unfortunately, it's very boring, but it's necessary. I hope that kind of makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
So you have mentioned a couple times that living in the communities that you work in is really helpful. And you talked about having assigned areas. Can you maybe give us some background on how you decide where you're headed? What's important to know before you show up? Why living in the communities is so important to doing the job you do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So living in the communities and kind of how we set up where we're going to go. So it's, for us, it's pretty simple. It's either Kharkiv or Kherson. Kharkiv is probably the most complex. Kherson, with the dam and everything, there is a lot of mines that have been shifted from the minefields to other areas. But Kharkiv is probably the most dynamic and complex when it comes to minefields, in my opinion. So when we figure out where we want to go, then we have to get approval. You can't just have rogue NGOs running around Ukraine anymore that are running out the fields to remove landmines out of them, and then there's no accountability for it. There's no reporting. There's no nothing like that. That's it doesn't defeat the purpose, but there's no structure to it. And so once we set up where we want to go, we get the approval through the proper Ministry of Interior department, and then they assign us with a district. Hey, these guys need a lot of help here. And it usually revolves around, because we do agriculture demining, so it usually revolves around the agricultural needs of that area. So then we'll be able to work in this district. So then that's when we start our rapport process. We meet with the local leaders of the district, the mayors, the governor, and stuff like that. And we put them in control. This is your area. Where do you guys want us at? What do you want us to do? And most of the time what we've noticed is they'll tell us an area that the Russians were in, or there has been fighting, or signs of troops. And that's really all the intel they have, because they don't want to go into those areas for fear of landmines. So then we have to start to conduct our non-technical surveys and our technical surveys. And once we find that first mine, then it's on. But the whole reporting process with that is, the GPS coordinates for every single mine, all that gets reported up to DS&S. If we're able to conduct remote pulls on them safely, then we contact DS&S with, hey, here's where we have staged these mines at for pickup. If we can't, then we don't actually have a demolition certification yet. And so DS&S will come out and blow those mines that we feel are too unsafe to remove, or if we have significant signs of booby trapping in the area, it's not worth your life. So that's pretty much how it works. But all of our intel and the majority of our non-technical survey comes from talking to the locals and empowering them. This is your area. What do you guys want us to do? How can we help you? How can we help you take back your farms and your lands and stuff like that? And so that's what we really focus on, is the whole human terrain and the rapport aspect, but also empowering them to have a choice and a
Ryan, thanks very much for that. So this is a great discussion. We're getting a lot of reports from listeners that there is a technical issue with the space and that only a few people are actually hearing this. So we want to make sure that people hear it. It's an unusual step, but what's being proposed to me, and I think we'll do, is we're going to take a break for 5 minutes. I'm going to end this space and start another one in the hopes that whatever glitch has happened can be resolved. So I'm sorry about that, but if you give me, 2-3 minutes, I'll get that started. I'll tweet out the new space invitation, and then hopefully we can resume with a lot more people joining us.
Absolutely. Yep. Not a problem at all.
Okay, guys. So we'll be back in about 2 minutes. Okay. Thanks very much.
All right.
Hi guys, thanks very much for rejoining us. We're just getting the administrative stuff set up. We'll start up again in just about 2 minutes. Okay, guys, we have most of the admin things taken care of. Thanks very much for understanding. That's what happens when you do live audio, and Twitter can be a little bit glitchy. Hopefully that solves it. Maybe I'll just say, hey, if you're hearing us, it's coming through okay, maybe you shoot a hands up, or a thumbs up in the emojis, and we'll know that we're good to go. So I'm seeing, okay, good. Starting to see lots of emojis in the audience. So thanks for that, guys. We'll bring up last speakers in a minute or two. But I think we can resume the discussion in a moment. We'll just hopefully get Andrew reconnected as co-host in a second. Perfect. All right. I think we're all set. So Ryan was running through a response to, what his day was like. And I know that Andrew had his hand up, I think, to jump into the discussion. So we'll resume the interview right here. Andrew, did you want to go ahead with your comment?
Yeah, sure. Ukraine is a very like computer oriented or maybe phone oriented society. So they have like they have apps for their artillery and apps for intelligence and apps for everything. I was just curious if there was some sort of app for the mining concerning maybe tracking who worked where or what areas have been worked on already, or is there any sort of centralized tracking like this, or is it purely done opaquely through the government or whatever? That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, so most of the minefield tracking is done through the government. Our reporting process goes up through the Ministry of Interior, who then is reported to the Ministry of Defense, because, as we all know, the Ministry of Defense is overall in charge of demining during wartime. So they're tracking the minefields and the clearance part of it, whether it's battle area clearance or like with Halo Trust or FSD, they're doing humanitarian clearance in approved areas. As far as a app to show who's removed what out of what area, there are numbers, and there's multiple billboards in Ukraine for numbers you can call if you have come across explosive remnants of war, landmines, booby traps, whatever it is. But as far as an active map that's kind of showing the cleared areas, no. Because, and again, this is me just giving my best experience on it and an explanation for what I think. But if you start to show the areas that have been cleared on an app, that also can aid into military operations in the future. So, no, I don't believe that there is a map an app that will show people what area has been cleared by who.
Well, that's disappointing for some of us who would love to track these things, which leads me actually into my next question. In your post yesterday, you said specifically, Ukraine is the world's largest minefield. Can you maybe quantify that or put some more context around that? Because part of the reason that I have been so interested in the idea of tracking the number of mines that are taken out of Ukraine is simply because I think that people don't grasp the enormity of that issue. And I think it would be really useful to publish some maybe non-area specific information about that, just so that people can functionally understand the number of munitions that you guys are dealing with on a regular basis. But if you could maybe put some context around that, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as information on how many explosive items and, go through all the categories of it, how many items have been removed from, said area or from Ukraine alone, there are those, I guess, what am I trying to say? Those numbers are out there. And I don't know readily how to get it, but I've definitely seen it with different demining organizations, we've removed set amount of mines from this oblast, or Ukraine has had however many numbers of mines, UXOs, and whatnot removed so far just in this square kilometer or hectare area. So there are numbers out there. It's just they're not going to show people where and who's working those areas, because that, again, there's still a war going on, and any of those areas, including Chernihiv, could become another infiltration point for Russian forces. And they all know which areas are clear via the app, or suspected to be clear via the app. So, but in given kind of a visual on the landmine crisis in Ukraine, is roughly the size of the state of Florida. And if you're in Europe, I've heard I forgot what country it was. Maybe Germany, or I could be wrong on that one, but it's enormous. And it's not just the mines from, this recent escalation in February. It's from 2014 to World War II. Still a lot of stuff being dug out of the ground from World War II. So Ukraine is never going to have a full grasp on just how many explosive items are out there. The same way France doesn't, Belgium doesn't, Poland doesn't, Germany doesn't. It's going to be the same situation in Ukraine. Now, before the escalation, to the best of Mine Action's knowledge, Egypt was the most mined country in the world before the escalation. And now it's just, we don't even have a grasp on how many mines have been placed in those defensive belts leading up to the defensive lines for the Russians. But the Ukrainians are finding out every time they try and break through the lines, they're finding out very quickly that these minefields are vast, and there's millions of mines that I believe we don't even know about yet, because we haven't been able to get into these areas, and the Russians aren't going to disclose, obviously, their defensive belts or their minefields. So not only is Ukraine the most mined country right now, but I believe it's going to far surpass anything anybody even knows that is in the ground, not all mines go in the ground, obviously, but all landmines and explosive hazards. I don't even think we have even an inkling of how much is in Ukraine right now. And it's going to be bad, and it's going to be astronomical, and it's going to be mind blowing. No pun intended on that, but you guys know what I'm saying.
We do indeed. I'm going to go to a different kind of tact that we've never had before, but I was going to go to a rapid fire round of questions. So these are a whole bunch of quick questions that if you want to expand on them, you're welcome to, but they might be just short little answers that you have here. So first one, how many different types of mines have you found?
Oh, geez. I mean, well over 12 to 15 different types.
That's a lot. That's a lot of, is there really specific knowledge, I assume, that you need to have for each of those?
There is. You definitely want to know the capabilities and what you're dealing with, or else you could. I mean, you could be dealing with something that's seismic, and you won't be dealing with it too long if it's armed. You got to have an idea what's in the area. You got to be able to break down who was in this area, which unit was in this area, and that's going to give you an idea of whether or not you're dealing with conscripted, infantry that just threw in mines and they're not well organized, or that's going to give you an idea if you're dealing with Spetsnaz sappers. I mean, if you had Chechens, Syrians, I mean, you have to know who was in the area. You got to do your research on the units, and that's going to give you a very good idea on the complexity of the minefields you're probably going to encounter.
We're already thrown off the rapid fire round. Andrew, I'll give you co-host privilege. Go ahead with your question.
You can let Sam go.
I'm sorry?
No, hey, Ryan, Sam. Double stacking. Is that for just a bigger bang, or is that just trying to get the EOD guy blown up? Why do they do a double stack?
No, double stacking of the TM62s. That's for more of a catastrophic disablement of that tank. Like a Tiger tank can take not a Tiger. What am I trying to say? The German, what are they? The Leopards. You're going to blow the track off them. But if you want to disable that tank, put it out of commission permanently, yeah, you're going to double and triple stack those things. Even with two TM62s on top of each other, the average human, if their fuses are as designed in the manufacturing plant to work that way, and what I mean by that is they haven't been tampered with or anything like that, you're still looking at hundreds of pounds of pressure to set that thing off. So it's not necessary. Double stacking isn't to kill, one deminer. That's a waste of mines. You're just, which in the end, the Russians probably don't care because they have millions of them. But you're not going to use a double stack TM62 to take out one deminer. That's just, you could be a victim of circumstance if they put an anti-tamper device on them. But no, the double stack is purely to cause more destruction to that military equipment, which is actually the bigger concern than dismounted infantry.
Sorry, Andrew, go ahead. I think you had a mic issue there.
I'm curious if Russia is sticking
Andrew,
to their
you're muted
their doctrine.
again.
Okay.
So, sorry, exit. This is just the way Twitter Live goes. Exit, we can hear Andrew fine. So if you recycle, then we'll bring you back up. Andrew, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm curious if Russia is sticking to their military doctrine, or are they branching out from it? And in either case, which would be the more dangerous scenario for you and your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as far as the combat engineer manual or how to construct a minefield, anything like that, it's I'm not going to say they're all the same internationally, but you can pick up any combat engineering manual or minefield layout from just about any military, organized military in the world, and they're gonna kind of have the same ideas and layouts to them. So as far as them sticking to doctrine, it's more predictable. When you start to get these other units in there that have been putting in mines, the bad part, or not the bad, the unpredictable part of some of these minefields is when you do get the conscripted forces, or as we call them, the JV teams. When you do get these guys in there that has a commander that's orchestrating this minefield layout that maybe he doesn't really know what he's doing, the erratic nature of the mines, the placement of the mines, it definitely can cause problems, because if you go into a minefield that it's been laid out by a company of sappers that actually have been trained on it, it's fairly easy once you find the pattern. You can step off your 8 to 10 to, let me not go down that road. You can pace out what they were, the distances between each mine, and it's fairly simple. And then you'll be able to see, all right, they're protecting them with anti-personnel mines or whatever. There's an organization to it. If you have an organization to a minefield, yes, you have to always be sweeping, as in you're going to encounter, that mine that's going to take you out. But if there is an organization to the minefield, it's more predictable for us. If there's no organization, or like PFM1, the butterfly mines, they're just shot over a field somewhere. That's what I mean by you have a structured minefield to you just have mines scattered everywhere. And that makes it a lot more difficult for us.
Andrew, you mentioned you had several questions you wanted to run by Ryan. Did you want to jump in with some of those?
Yeah, sure. So you're talking before that. I think you said that Kharkiv has been more sophisticated than Kherson. I think you said that before. Why would that be? Is it because it's more focused on like tree lines and towns and less on farm fields?
Well, one of the biggest reasons, in my opinion and experience, is because I only have one trip to Kherson and I have 5 trips to Kharkiv. But from the different intelligence we're getting, talking to the different demining groups, whether it's DS&S or it's Ukrainian military sappers, Kharkiv, even in their opinion, is the most complex because the Russians paid the most attention to those areas as far as rigging them up or defending them. Now, the Russians, in my opinion, have always had a calculated withdrawal aspect to their operations. And the reason why I say that is because the more mines that have been laid and the more sophisticated those minefields are, or the booby traps or whatnot, shows that instead of a full-blown retreat, that's a calculated withdrawal. And Kharkiv has a lot of minefields, and it's not the presence of erratic landmine laying, as in, hey, let's try and slow down the pursuing force. Let's get these out there, and that'll slow them down to let us get back to some sort of safety. There are some extremely sophisticated minefields in Kharkiv, which shows the presence, in my opinion. And again, I'm not General Schwarzkopf, but in my opinion, it shows the presence of a tactical withdrawal rather than a full-blown retreat. And that tactical withdrawal means that they have put in those minefields well before they withdrew, knowing full well that, hey, if things get to this point and we have to withdraw, these minefields are already in here. And that's I believe from, again, there's a lot of people that have been doing a lot of great stuff in Ukraine, and they probably know way better than I do. But in my experience, that's what I've seen, and that's the reason why, in my opinion, they've had more time there, which is why it's more sophisticated.
So just extrapolating from that, would you assume, and I know you haven't been there, but would you assume that Zaporizhia would be even more sophisticated since they've had even more time?
Oh, I've been to Zaporizhia, and yes, by all means, anywhere where the counteroffensive is going right now, the front lines, they're going to encounter. The deeper in they go, the more complex it's going to be, because the more time they've had to do there, or they've been there. I mean, you've heard about the decoy trenches that they go to clear and the entire trench blows up. And that's the same thing as what the Taliban were doing with the houseborne IEDs. Same thing. As you continue to move on through those defensive belts that the Russians have set up, because, again, I firmly believe that there has been a line that they have been building up for the defense of their areas that they've taken. I believe that they've been building these lines up for a year now, in my opinion. Again, I'm not in the war room with Russian generals or anything, but in my opinion, these lines have been being built up for quite some time.
Sam, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Ryan, do you think will your team stay in the Kharkiv area, or do you think you'll ever get closer to the front lines?
So no, we don't demine in support of combat operations. As the front lines move and as the need for deminers in those areas come up, then if we can safely demine, and what I mean by that is the minefield is our only focus. We're not worried about drones. We're not worried about artillery, indirect fire, anything like that. The minefield is our full focus. Then we'll move into those areas. But no, for right now, there are farm areas and there are minefields that are they desperately need clearance now, and they're nowhere near the front. So no, there's a ton of work to do that doesn't involve demining near the front lines right now.
Okay, so focusing on the agricultural is number one for your guys.
Correct, because agriculture demining has a second and a third order of effects.
Yeah,
you're not only removing those landmines from that farm field, which is protecting that Ukrainian farmer and the villagers in that area, but it's also allowing him to produce the agricultural product that's needed throughout the world, which then gets agricultural products to whichever port to be delivered to mostly African countries that in some cases depend on Ukrainian agricultural exports for their very survivability. So that's the reason we can actually do more, in my opinion, demining in the areas where they're actually conducting agricultural revitalization operations than to be on the front lines removing mines for the counteroffensive. Is it needed? Absolutely. But in my opinion, and the way our organization as a nonprofit and non-combatants goes, we'll be working in the areas where they're actively conducting agricultural revitalization operations, and we will do our part with agricultural demining.
And now everybody understands why demining is so important to me, because I track a lot of the exports of grain out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative when it was running, and hopefully that'll come back again at some time soon. And the demining is obviously a huge driver towards enabling Ukraine's agricultural abilities going forward and like for years to come. This isn't just an issue that is going to affect them for the next 5 years. This is an issue that will affect them for the next 10 to 20 years, depending on how long this takes. Maybe I'll get back to a couple of questions that I had in the rapid fire. How many organizations are helping to demine Ukraine right now?
So that's a hard question to answer. I don't know, to give you the honest to God's truth. But what I do know is this. So there are some major organizations over there. Obviously, everybody knows of Halo Trust, FSD, Mine Action Group. There's also some Ukrainian demining organizations that are conducting demining operations as well. Recently, Ukraine has basically enacted, well, not enacted, but they have gone back to pre-February 2022 mine action standards, which, you know, is necessary. All countries, if you're going to go in there and conduct landmine removal operations, you have to be certified in the country. You have to have your SOPs verified, insurances and everything like that. So that's what everybody right now. So before I would say, what is it? It's August right now. So before June of this year, there was probably a lot more remove or demining organizations than there is right now, because you have to go through all those steps with your SOPs and everything like that, which is good. That's the way it's supposed to be. And so once the dust clears, I would say there's probably going to be 15 demining NGOs working in Ukraine, would be my opinion.
And how many different types of detectors do you guys use for that job?
Yeah, so right now, well, the brand of detector that I use, just because it was an extension of my right arm in Afghanistan, is the CHEA detectors. So they're out of Italy, and I really their technology that they have with those detectors, it allows it to do some things that some of the other competitors or other detectors can't do. And one of the biggest ones is we can work in an electromagnetic field, as in, for example, under power lines. Because it's continuous wave, it's not pulse induction. Another good benefit with the CHEA detectors is there's 5 different channels that they work off of, which allows you to work within 1 meter of the next deminer, not 15 meters. So it's there's a lot of benefits for it. Obviously, with the technology comes the price, which is why you guys have all seen us. Well, if you've been to our Twitter page at all, you've seen the spot fund and everything else. But in my opinion, that's, those are the detectors that we use, and that's the technology that's going to keep the deminer the safest, and to have well, I've already said it, but to have the best technology literally in your right or left hand. Whichever hand you sweep with, but yeah, that's what I use. The CHEAs have 3 different versions, version 1, 2, and 3. And so I guess if you were to ask how many different detectors do we use, it would be 3 of them. And then we also use the assistance of a drone, but not with all the technology that people have been seeing on Twitter and on YouTube lately. The drone assists us with our technical survey, as in we'll fly the drone over the field, and if we see the presence of anything surface laid, well, then we got our answer. Here it is. It also gives us situational awareness, and it helps break down the terrain and what we're looking at. We can, the drone is used primarily for, here's the Russian trench line, here's the way the sandbags and the fighting positions are pointing, which means the minefield is probably out the other way. There's the direction the Ukrainians, or they anticipated the Ukrainians to come from. All right, here's a field that we're probably, let's dive a little deeper into here.
Thank you. That was the end of rapid fire. That wasn't quite so rapid fire, but that's okay. Sam,
Sorry.
did you want to ask a question there?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for hosting the space as well. Ryan, thank you and your team for everything you're doing. I know I've said that to you before, but I have to say it again because it's so important. It's every mine removed is a life saved. But that said, what is the most common anti-personnel mines you're running across, and the specific challenges associated with them?
Yeah, no, this is extremely easy rapid fire right here. PFM1, butterfly mines, and the PMN4s. The challenges with those is because they're scatterable, and which means there's no, like with the PFM1, the butterfly mines, there's no structure to it. They're just scattered. They're shot out of canisters, whether it's helicopter laid, vehicle, artillery, they're shot out of canisters, and they're indiscriminate. And there's no structure to them. So that's the greatest challenge with all these. Also with the PFM1, the butterfly mines, is it takes 0.05 pounds of pressure, cumulative pressure, to set it off. So very, very sensitive. So what's the answer? How do you deal with them? Well, that's one of the best ways we found to deal with them is once we have the farmer's permission, we burn the whole field. If the field has the fuel in it and what we need to actually really get a good flame going, because they are very sensitive to flame. The PMN4s, not so much. You can burn the whole field and still have PMN4s out there, but also PMN4s are a bit bigger and usually they're personnel laid, which means you have a guy with a bunch of them, and they're just kind of tossing them out to where they think foot movement is going to be. Still not really a pattern to them, but it's a little bit more predictable. But yeah, the PMN4s and the PFM1s, probably the most encountered anti-personnel device that's not a bounding mine. Once you get into the bounding mines, we've encountered a lot of OSINT-72s, which are probably the nastiest mine. Oh God, they're horrible. And they go along the same lines as the Palm 2 or the Palm 3s, but those OSINT-72s are just they're just straight killers. I don't know another name for them. You set one of those off, everything within 30 meters is dead. So pretty nasty mines.
I know Monty was recently, or not too recently, injured by one. Was that a OZM or was that a toe popper?
Oh, no. Monty didn't. If Monty hit an OZM, we would have had a funeral. Not him in a hospital. No, he stepped on a PMN4. So, yeah, an anti-personnel.
Gotcha. Well, I hope he's doing well. Just pass on our well wishes to him and his family, please.
I will, definitely. Thank you.
So just to clarify for everybody else in the space, because not everybody understands these things, are the butterflies that you were just talking about the same as cluster munitions that we hear so much lately in the news?
No, the butterfly mines are the scatterable. They're scatterable anti-personnel mines. The cluster munitions, staying away from politics on it and everything like that. The cluster munitions are a bit different. So you can have cluster munitions that are there they can both do anti-armor and anti-personnel, which means they have a fragmentation capability, but also a shape charge. You have cluster munitions that are just straight anti-personnel. And then, it's basically it, either anti-vehicle or anti-personnel. And then the catastrophic situation with cluster munitions is the dud rate. And how do you deal with them? Well, you got to blow them in place. They're just too, like the 3B30s that we were encountering in Kherson. You can't, there's nothing you can do. You have to blow them in place. You can't, you can't pick them up. You can't, that's where the casualties are coming in at with the civilian casualties is because they look shiny. They look cool. What is this? You pick it up and you may be fine, or you may lose your arm, or you may lose your life. So, cluster munitions are different than the PFM1 butterfly mines.
I'll just interrupt X's line of questioning to follow up on what you just said, Ryan. You talking about the civilian engagement with the explosive, dangers. Mm-hmm. Are you noticing any improvement, like adaptation learning on the part of civilians? Are there education campaigns going on you think are working? That they're more careful, they have a better understanding of things?
Absolutely. I don't know if it's educational campaigns that are going on, because we've been asked to also add that to our portfolio as far as educating children. And that's where my heart is. It was there in Afghanistan, Iraq, and it's there in Ukraine. The children, it's really the hard one for me. And so coming up with those playing cards or whatever can give them idea about danger. But unfortunately, the education campaign, a lot of people are figuring out what's bad, what's dangerous, and where not to go because of civilian casualties, death, and injuries. So, yes, is there educational campaigns out there? Absolutely. Driving through Ukraine, you'll see billboards, don't touch this, here's Patron the dog, fill in all the blanks. Great. Every bus stop, it'll have pamphlets up there. Here's the dangers in the area. Don't touch this. Yes, the Ukrainians are doing the best that they possibly can to keep the civilians safe through information awareness. The problem is Ukrainians are also trying to get back to their lives, and they're tired of being in prison to landmines and explosive devices, which is causing them to venture out more, which causes an injury or death, and then that's how they know stay out of this area because of this, or injury. That's why I know don't pick up a butterfly mine, don't pick up a 3B30, don't, and so unfortunately I think the more education is coming in because of the civilian casualties, not so much organized educational campaigns on landmines.
For those who are interested, I put a link to that explosive hazard awareness cards that Ryan referred to up in the nest, just if you're not familiar with them. They made the sort of like in past conflicts, they would make cards with, high value targets on them. They did the same with explosive ordnance risks. But anyway, back to you, Exit.
So I guess that begs the question, what qualifications do you need to join your team? Are you guys looking for new members? You're kind of expanding what you do in Ukraine. What are kind of your top 5 priorities there? And how many, I know you're also looking at training other demining teams. Is there like a number of demining teams that you're trying to get to in a year, or just more information kind of about what you guys are, your priorities in Ukraine?
Yeah, no, that's a great question right there, and it's our new focus. So, as far as us expanding, that's straight up out of their own pocket volunteers about is. We basically have a model that we go by that I used in Special Forces, but it was the train, advise, and assist. So 6 to 8 Westerners out on a minefield, we're doing great work, but we're not even putting a drop in the bucket. There's millions and millions of mines in Ukraine. And so although you'll see me, pulling a mine out, or we just removed, 300 TM62 P3s from this field or whatever it is, that's not even a drop in the bucket. That's not even a mist. It's nothing. Hey, we're going to actually be able to tackle this crisis that's going on in Ukraine is, number one, where are the priority areas? Because it breaks my heart to say it, but Ukraine will never be mine free. It's impossible. There's too many mines there, unless they were to pull up all of eastern Ukraine 1 foot underneath the ground, pull it all up, put in new dirt, and start over again. I just don't see how it's possible to do it. So number one is where are the priority areas, and number two, it's force multiplying. But I don't believe the answer is bringing in a bunch of Westerners or foreigners to demine in Ukraine. I believe the answer that we have is, again, as a Special Forces Green Beret, what did we do? We would force multiply to create a bigger, well, in that case, fighting force. Well, in this case, it's going to be a demining force. So we're going to use the Ukrainians that are already there. We're going to use the Ukrainians that are looking for that paycheck. They're looking for that purpose. They're looking for that reason to, to have. We're taking back our own country. We're demining our own lands. This is my purpose, and we're focusing on the veterans. We're focusing on the veterans that they still have that purpose. Ukrainians are no different language, same people. Ukrainians are no different than your Canadian, your American, your Brit, your Aussie. No difference at all. When you leave a conflict like that and you're sitting at home 2 or 3, or in some cases 21 years, there's a very big question of what's my purpose? Who am I? And I believe it does. It trails directly into mental health. And so we are focusing on the veteran communities. Not only are we a veteran organization, but we want to train up and enable and empower the Ukrainians that are looking for their purpose now to take back their own lands. And be able to earn a living doing it. And so that's what we're focusing on, and that's why I talk about us expanding. Because that's the only way we're going to make a difference. That's the only way we're going to make an impact. It is absolutely impossible to do it with 8 guys. Literally, it looks cool on videos. Yeah, got it. We didn't even touch the bucket, let alone make a drop in it.
That's a sobering thought, and nice to understand that you guys have a grasp on that concept and are working to kind of move that forward and find solutions that include so many veterans, because you're absolutely right that mental health for veterans is going to be such a big issue in Ukraine generally. And if you can find a way to give those people purpose, that's really going to be helpful. I have one more question. You specifically mentioned that you use drones, but not in the shiny, flashy ways that we've seen lately. And if you don't know what Ryan's talking about, I will put some links up in the nest here in a second, just about, we've seen people in the front line using drones with their infrared to be able to see mines that are heated up by the sun, things like that. Is there places where technology can be helpful to the demining that you do? I know that months ago, before certain people from the emergency services had kind of left Twitter, I had been talking to them about some of the drone projects that they had to try and view mines before they got into an area. But are there areas that you see technology actually being useful going forward here?
Absolutely. Technology is going to be the answer for the global landmine crisis. We are focused on Ukraine right now, but there's a lot of areas around the world where their populations live in fear of their next step also. Technology is going to be huge. Whether it's advancements right now, it's leaning towards the drone. Whether it's a drone with a magnometer on it or GPR or whatever it is, right? It's leaning that way. There's also fixed wing aircraft that they're talking about. Obviously, right now, that's a no-go in Ukraine, but a fixed wing aircraft that can map out this minefield and be able to give you that. I mean, that same drone technology that they're using when the sun comes up or goes down with the infrared, the aircraft have that too, and they can take those snapshot pictures and be able to give us a rough idea of the layout of it. A big portion of our time, and the reason why technology is going to be so critical is so going all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, I had mentioned we go through the villagers. Our non-technical survey, we talk to the locals, we talk to the government officials and the mayor, and then they take us out to an area and they're like, yep, this was all Russian. Okay, where are the mines? I don't know. But there's mines here. We know they're here because the Russians told us they were here. Okay, now we got to find them. The minefields that are really easy are the ones we go in and it's, hey, tractor hit a mine right here. Okay, we already found that first mine. Now let's figure out the belt. Let's figure out the pattern. Okay, good to go. Hit the gas. Well, don't hit the gas pedal, but you guys know what I mean. Now we can get moving. Finding those mine belts, that is so time consuming. It is daunting. If we have a piece of equipment, and it's coming, I don't know from who, but it's coming. If we have a piece of equipment that can give us a snapshot of these buried mines, the surface laid ones are easy. You can fly a drone over there and okay, good to go. There's the buried mines, the ones that were actually put in by either a mine laying machine or a unit that had time there. Those are the ones that aren't heating up in the sun. If we have that technology to where we can figure out where those mine belts are at, that is I don't know a percentage, but I'm going to throw out that's 75% of our time is just finding where these mine belts even start at. Not to mention doing a non-technical and a technical survey, tromping around a farm field, trying to find if there is presence of explosives in order to constitute this as a minefield. It's pretty dangerous too, because I've been on a field where we were looking for that anti-tank mine belt and we stumbled into a PFM1 minefield. So it's, and obviously I don't mean stumble. I'm just throwing some slang out there, but we had encountered a PFM1 minefield, which then we got the approval to burn it, and it was pretty cool. But that's what I'm talking about. It's technology is going to make it safer and it's going to make it quicker. And so, yes, 100%, there is going to definitely, there is a need for technology in demining. And I think Ukraine is going to change the demining work globally for forever. I do. That's my belief on it.
So just in terms of timing, I have a question for Andrew, or excuse me, I have a question for Ryan. Then I'll invite Andrew to ask some questions that he has. Then we'll go to the audience questions. But Ryan, if you have any limitations on your time, or you're getting, you have a window, just let us know. That's totally cool. And so my question, talking about a moment ago, you're saying knowing where the mines are is a huge help. When Ukraine is laying its own minefields, which, it has cause to do, it's totally understandable. When they have records of them, does that speed up the process for you guys, or does it have to be cleared in essentially the same way?
No, so yes, Ukraine lays their own minefields, and those minefields, if we get approval from the Ministry of Defense to remove them, they're extremely easy, because they're following, so they're obviously, again, I'm trying to figure out how to word this correctly. There's rules for minefields. There are, there's actually guidelines for laying minefields and how to do it properly. I've already talked about it earlier with combat engineering guides and stuff like that. If Ukraine says, hey, we are good, we can pull this defensive belt up, then it's not difficult at all. Number one, they're not booby trapping them. And the biggest part of putting in a minefield is it has to be, as crazy as this is going to sound, it has to be relatively easy to be taken up by sappers or combat engineering units or humanitarian deminers. A lot of times mine belts are moved, and so they have to do it for their own safety anyways. We're going to pick these mines up as the front lines move, and we're going to now put them in over here. They have to be able to be disarmed, and they have to be able to, and you got to be able to find them relatively easy. So yes, Ukrainian minefields, we'll just stick with to not go down a rabbit hole, we'll just stick with the TM62s. But like an anti-vehicle minefield, anti-tank minefield, Ukrainian laid, I wish we could. That was my only job in Ukraine. That would be great, easy.
Well, that's great insight. That came to my mind because I imagine as the front line is moving, and potentially, with winter coming, I presume that at least temporarily, Ukraine's going to be wanting to move or put in defensive positions in some of those newly taken territories. So it's good to know that that's a lot more straightforward process for you. Andrew, did you want to come in with a couple of questions?
Yeah, sure. I have two questions. First, I think you already touched on, but I just want to circle back to it real quick. We have some stats from Kherson regarding mines. They claim that they are clearing 450 hectares per day and taking about 200 explosive devices are destroyed every day. And I'm just curious, do those numbers sound right to you? Because it's really hard for someone like me to analyze these kind of statistics.
So no, they don't sound right to me at all. And I'm not calling anybody out, but the first thing you said they're clearing. You can't actually constitute an area clear unless it's been approved by the Ukrainian government for land release and humanitarian demining. So they may be removing or doing battle area clearance of everything that's within these hectaacres per day and removing what they if it's per day and it's that many mines, unless they have 100 or 200 in the company that are doing it, there's probably a lot of displaced mines from the flooding, or they're surface laid, which would make sense to me. But you can't actually clear an area during active conflict. You can only conduct battle area clearance, but that land will not get a land release signed and given to the farmer as this area has been cleared.
Okay, but so taking away
is a reason why.
Taking away the wordage, the verbiage here, does like 450 hectare, does that sound right? Just as an area, or do you think it's more or less?
400 hectares?
Yeah, like 450.
I mean, if a hectare is 2.26 acres, I mean, if they have 500 or 1,000 people, yeah, I would assume so. But it depends on the size of their group. That's all I could really go off of. I mean, it depends on the size of their group, but that's a hell of a lot of acres per day. That's awesome if they are. But I'm not going to expand on what I feel is right or wrong because I don't want to call anybody out. That's not my position. If they are, absolutely impressive and super good work. I'm very happy for them. It's a lot of hectares per day.
Okay. I have another question, and this is kind of going off the rails a little bit, but I got a message earlier this morning, and it was basically a person in Ukraine claiming that there was a market for having your farmland cleared. Is this true? I honestly don't know anything about this sort of thing. I'm just curious if you can clear that up.
I would imagine, I mean, again, I can't, I don't know out of experience, but I would imagine there is, because there are a lot of extremely wealthy Ukrainians that are trying to get their agricultural business back on track again. They've taken a major hit since the war, fill in all those blanks. So I could only imagine that there would be, but that's my opinion. No, I can't verify it. I don't know. I haven't seen it, but I would imagine, I would imagine it would be, yeah.
Okay, well, that's an interesting question about the market. I guess, we've also seen lots of videos of farmers taking matters into their own hands, making their own, remote tractors, demining. And so I'd imagine that if you've taken the trouble to build one of those for yourself, and it worked pretty well, I wonder if could a homemade tool be used like that and then a certificate be obtained on it, or, no? Okay. Anyway,
no, it has to be humanitarianly cleared. Here's the problem: is there are not enough certified humanitarian clearance organizations in Ukraine in order to be able to give out the amount of land release certificates that these guys need to get back on track. So what they're doing is they're taking, this is my land. I'm going to take my life back. I'm tired of waiting, regardless of what the situation or the circumstances are. I'm tired of waiting. I'm going to do this myself. And so, yeah, I've definitely been in areas where I'm like, wow, that tractor is driving itself. And, it has a mine roller on the front. Wow, that's really cool. And then you just see this tractor, or this vehicle come by, and they got the remote control system in it. And man, that is really awesome. So yes, they are definitely, they're taking back their lives again. And you can't blame them. And it's not the Ukrainian government's fault. It's not the farmers' fault. They are taking a hell of a risk, but the Ukrainian government is able to mitigate that risk by saying, hey, we did not give you a land release. So you're taking your life into your own hands. A lot of these farmers, they're saying, well, hey, there are demining organizations out here. Let me get their help. And so that's why I would assume, there's got to be oligarchs or somebody that's paying for their lands to be cleared. It would only make sense to me. And because there's just so many big international farms in Ukraine. I would just think that it would be a thing. Yes.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because now I'm thinking about the impact on land values, whether there's a certificate issued or not, and so on. But anyway, I'll run through the audience hands that are up. I apologize, guys. I didn't see the order you came up in. I'm going to go with Nukes, Gurney, and then Sam. Go ahead, Nukes.
Yeah. So I had a quick question. I know technology is huge, and it's getting bigger and bigger in the future. But I'm also a big proponent of the low-tech solution. So I'm just a little curious on burning a field. I assume it's pretty effective against the scattering mines like the PFM1, since they're on the surface. Has it been effective at all against any of the buried mines or the anti-tank mines?
So to say no would be incorrect, but I have definitely been in an area where the farmers, again, it circles all the way back to the farmers are trying to take back their own lives. They have lit their fields on fire, and you can hear the fuses from the TM62s pop. I have not seen a TM62 in my experience. I've not seen fire be able to detonate one. And the issue, so the other thing fire does is with the TM62 P3s, it'll just completely melt them away, because the TM62 P3 is, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm fairly certain it's 99% plastic and RDX. So it'll just melt those away, and you'll go out and you'll conduct your battle damage assessment. Well, not battle damage. Damn. Your survey, I guess you could say. You'll go out and you'll kind of assess what the fire did, and you'll see, a whole line of these perfect little burnt out discs where a TM62 P3 used to be at. The hotter the fire, obviously, the more damage it's going to do to it, to the device. The problem is they burn their fields every single year, which then it means that there's not going to be as much fuel for that fire. What's good is coming up. A lot of these fields that have been mined for close, or have been not touched for close to 2 years coming up. So that means that's 2 years of vegetation that has grown, died, and that's going to be a lot more fuel, which is going to produce a lot hotter heat and intensity of that fire, which then, I don't know, it could. I don't see it detonating a TM62M, but it'll burn the fuses off of them. The only issue there is someone still has to go out and deal with that. And now you got a device that's extremely pissed off by fire, and you got to go out and handle it. And that's when you just locate them and blow them in place. Fire is amazing, primarily because, it does destroy the PFM1s. I love it for that, because PFM1s are nasty. But the primary thing fire does is, like with the OSINT-72s, it'll burn off those tripwires, because it's just aluminum wire or copper. It'll burn off those tripwires, number one, but number two, it allows you to see where you're going. And that's the biggest benefit of fire. People ask me all the time, well, How do you know fire is going to destroy this, or won't it make this more sensitive? And I'm like, yeah, it probably could, but I would rather burn that field so I can see where I'm stepping and see where I'm working and deal with something that's even more sensitive because it's been heated up than to have 5 feet. I don't know if people have seen my videos, but we've definitely cleared in 5 feet of brush. And yeah, they haven't been affected by heat, but now I'm affected by all this vegetation. That's a personal opinion and a preference of mine.
Exit, go ahead.
So this brings me to a weather question because David's not here to ask it. I know that it's been relatively dry in the last 2 weeks. It's starting to come into the really dry harvest period for farmers. Is that also part of the reason that you guys chose September to go back, because it's easier to burn fields when they're this dry and then be able to have a safer environment to work in?
No, not really. We September going back in September was for a few reasons. It wasn't really burning. That is good to know that it's been dry, because fire is definitely, in my opinion, an ally to deminers. But the drier it gets, now you got to worry about how big of a fire do you want? How much is that actually going to burn? And yeah, the last thing you need is a California acreage wildfire that, oh, by the way, there's a bunch of mines out here too. So that's the only issue as it gets drier out. You got to watch, obviously fire can spread fairly quickly. No, September is, we have finalized all our SOPs, as I talked about earlier, and we're going to go back and verify our SOPs for our final accreditation. Then we'll be good to go. So that's one of the reasons for that. But we're also already accredited as a training organization. So we're going to start to get our groups back. Not back. We're going to start to get our new groups together and get ready for our pretty aggressive train and advise portion of it. SOPs get approved, and then it's assessed portion. But it just pretty much fell in line with the dry season, which is great.
Gurney, please go ahead.
Hey, Ryan, good to see you here. Hey, not to advocate for any tech here, but there was some open source reporting maybe last fall that was showing, allegedly showing some industrial scale geologic equipment that was in the Kherson region. I'm not sure if you had seen that or knew of it. Have you seen any of those machines? They're industrial scale. They're like a giant Komatsu, and they put out seismic ground waves, and it seems like they've been adapted. I know it might have been misreported. It looked like somebody reported they were possibly disarming, but it looks like they were using them potentially to actually map some of the buried ones, or that had vegetation over it, because the reflections back off of it. Is there any truth to that? Have you seen any of those, or can you speak to that?
So I have not seen them, but I've definitely heard about them. There are a lot of countries that are donating, and they're equipping Ukraine with some amazing technology for this demining crisis that's going on there. I've heard of it, but no, I've not seen them in play, nor have I seen the end product, what it produces. I don't know. I'm assuming it's a sonar kind of, thing to be able to, GPR type, to be able to tell you the disturbance in this area or whatnot. But yes, I've definitely heard of it, and I've 100% have seen multiple flatbed semi trucks coming in with some pretty extravagant looking demining stuff in tow. So there's a lot of good stuff coming into Ukraine, and I'm excited to see what they do and to have them clear these areas. And it's just, it's good news to help with the demining process.
Speaking of aid, it's nice to see that I believe it was Japan, and I think it was Cambodia, had been sending training teams. And so it's nice to see that countries that have gone through the experience of sharing their knowledge. And then just on the tech front, because we talked about, thermal, and we talked about magnetic, and we talked about the vibrations. there also was a report about people making software that could visually recognize, like through the camera, and identify. And so I don't know how good any of that is, but I just thought I'd toss that in so the audience hears about it. So we're going to go to Sam, and then we'll probably take a last question from Piotr. Go ahead, Sam.
Thank you again. Ryan, I just didn't know if you'd heard anything about the MV4 or the MV10 remote demining equipment. We were talking about technology earlier. There's also the M160, which I think is in Army inventory. Is there any way to get something like that to you and your team to make this job a little bit easier and safer for you guys?
Yeah, sorry, guys. Sometimes when a problem comes up and you can't hear, I don't know if it's just me, but it sounds like we're not able to hear Ryan at the moment.
I can't hear Ryan. He's not audible for me.
Yeah. So
I was like, did I say something?
yeah. So Ryan, I don't know if you can hear us. If you're having a problem, then it might make sense for you to drop out of the space and then rejoin, and we'll bring you back up right away.
But what I was just basically trying to say is, like, there's all these, like you were saying earlier, there's these Ukrainian farmers taking their lives into their own hands, demining, and I don't know how much these systems cost in terms of the MV4, which is the lighter, I believe, anti-personnel demining robot, and then the MV10, which is, I believe, covers TM62s and such. The U.S. Army operates the M160, which they fielded in Afghanistan. I don't know if they fielded it in Iraq, but I would definitely like to hear his opinion on that. So.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have Ryan rejoin us. It looks like he's coming up now, so we'll just take a second for him to join. Hey, Ryan, if you can hear now, sorry, we just couldn't hear you after that last question was asked. Just looks like he is connecting. If there's a tech problem, then we'll move on briefly for a moment and see if we can sort it out. Ryan is reconnecting again, so just bear with us, guys. Hey, Ryan, are you back with us?
It shows him as, like, connecting on my side. I don't know if Twitter is being...
Yeah,
it shows us up for me, so I think it might be his end.
Yeah, so so we'll see if we can get him back in a moment. Piotr, would it make sense? Do you need to hold your question until you have Ryan here, or is it? Did you have more of a comment?
No, it was a comment into question. I mean, if Ryan can rejoin, I'd be interested for his opinion because I've never met him before, so it's nice to hear his perspective. But maybe Michael, you can answer it, or Andrew, excuse me. But what is the extent of mining in the East now? I was reading one report a couple of weeks back. I think it said it would take 20-25 years to demine, and I was just wondering if anyone had any knowledge of the broader situation for the East and just how many, because if we're talking about demining certain areas, but what about the whole of I'm just curious in the broader picture, to be honest.
Well, we had a bit of a discussion with that about that with Ryan early on in our conversation, and that it's very difficult to get a broad picture on that, and so hard to put a number. Andrew has been putting out updates from the governor of the Kherson region. I believe it's the governor, and that's one of the only regions reporting on it. But again, just that it's a huge problem that will take many, many years to resolve. Andrew's put his hand up, so we'll go to Andrew, and then I think Ryan has rejoined us, so we'll take his responses to Sam. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, just quickly. I know that Avdiivka is ridiculously mined. Like, it's just minefields on top of minefields on top of minefields. And I'm sure most of the old front line is pretty much the same way. So that's just my brief comment.
Yeah, part of the challenge is that the area where there is fighting now may have the densest levels, and there's just not a lot of insight into what those levels specifically are. So Ryan, it sounds like you may be back. If you heard Sam's question, did you want to come back with an answer?
I did not hear his question.
Sam, did you want to pose it again?
Yeah. No, I just was wondering if there's any possible way to get you guys and your team a remote demining system. Like I don't know if you're familiar with the NV4, which is I believe suited for anti-personnel stuff, and there's the NV10. They're through the private company Doctrine, I think. And then there's, I don't know if you're familiar with the M160, which I believe was used in Afghanistan to clear anti-personnel mines. I know it's in the U.S. Army inventory. I don't know if any have been sent to Ukraine, but I imagine either of those would be great for your mission.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the biggest issue is funding. So nothing, obviously nothing's free. And that's the problem that we run into is we have the funds right now for the team that we have to conduct manual demining, non-technical surveys and technical surveys. As we advance, obviously it takes more funds, but yeah, anything that gives that deminer a remote standoff and the ability to control something remotely and is obviously safety for us, whether it's robotic. Mechanical demining is different. When you start to get into the big flail machines and stuff like that, you have to have a mechanical demining certification in Ukraine, which obviously is money. And then you're talking about machines that are $400,000 plus. So yeah, there's a lot of hurdles to get through with that. But as far as using robotics for your technical survey part, yeah, absolutely. Whatever keeps the deminer safe.
I also know there's last thing I'll say is that I know there's some ground penetrating radar drones that I don't know if you're aware of. I can maybe send you a DM or link on that. They might help your mission as well with the TM62s.
Yeah, no, we're tracking the GPR drones out there, and again, when it comes, once we get the funding in, we can start to start to increase our technology aspect of demining. But they can have all the technology in the world, but if you don't have the money, it's great. That's about it, though.
Well, make sure you tag me in any of your fundraisers coming up. I'll do what I can to share and get that money in.
Absolutely, will do. Thank you very much.
Piotr, did you want to come in with the last question?
Yeah, I did actually, and feel free to move on if you don't fancy it, Ryan or anyone else. But moving from the tactical to the strategic a little bit level, I've been reading some reports from Atlantic Council and just some articles here and there about the next offensive, and obviously we're moving into winter months, so there's a closing window for any successes to be seen. About the mining situation, what impact could this have over the winter and going into 2024 if we're able to demine certain areas, if the Russians try to dig in with yet more mines or something? I'm just curious for your thoughts on that, if you had any.
So as far as the front lines and with the winter months coming up, yeah, as the ground gets ready to freeze, people are kind of trying to get in, whether it's it's 100% the Russians, but the Russians in the defensive lines, they're definitely putting in as many landmines as they can before the winter months come. And I believe, but here's the thing, I said it earlier in our talk, the Russians have had, in my opinion, at least a year to fortify these lines to where the Ukrainians are at right now. I believe they anticipated it, and there are multiple layers upon layers upon layers, and I don't believe the Ukrainians have seen the nastiest layers yet. I believe they've broken through a couple of the layers, but I think it just gets worse and worse and worse as you get closer to those positions and breaking through into the occupied areas. So in my opinion, yeah, they're probably going to continue to fortify either areas that they take back or whatever it is. But in my opinion, I think that they've had quite a long time to create just one nasty defensive line with multiple layers, and it's all, and the foundation of it is all landmines. So yeah, that's my opinion on it.
Piotr, did you want to come in with a fast follow-up?
Yeah. Okay. So, what do you think that then does for funding? What do you think that then does for public sentiment? And I know this is longer term again, but I was in one conversation with some people who are not as hardline pro-Ukraine, and they were, saying that we're already talking about offensive 2024, and it's sort of just, is the appetite going to be there in the run-up to the election? So I don't know, from your perspective, seeing this all firsthand, whether that makes a difference or not.
I don't think I understand your question. As far as funding for demining, or
support to the war effort. If the mining is so heavy and it's only going to get worse over the winter, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, because it's we want the Ukrainians to break through, but it's tricky if we're seeing them struggle at the moment.
I'm not going to expand on that. That's getting into politics and military operations, and I'm going to just stick with agriculture demining and what I do. What I can actually back up through facts, not assumptions or opinions.
Fair enough, man.
Well, Ryan is obviously an incredibly brave man, but politics is too dangerous a minefield for him to tread into. And so with that, Ryan, thanks very much for joining us. Fascinating conversation. Obviously, the work that you're doing is critically important. For those listening, the link to Ryan's profile, it's up in the nest. And, he and his team have lots of plans for expansion, including into training. And so if you want to support him, go check out that tweet, and you can find details there on how to do that. So Ryan, thank you very much for joining us.
Can I shamelessly plug his book really quick? It's available on a lot of places and on Audible. If you haven't read it, I do encourage it.
Great.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I definitely appreciate you guys having me on. This was an awesome conversation. And I do believe education is that's huge internationally. People need to understand the crisis that's going on there, but not just the Ukrainians being affected by it, but the second and the third order of effects with agriculture, and how that not only is, but it already has started to show its impacts around the world with countries that rely on Ukrainian agricultural exports. So I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to share my limited experience on that, and hopefully, maybe some people learned a little something and spread the word. But Ukraine, it is a global crisis, and it's affecting so many around the world. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to just share my little bit of experience and what we're doing.
And so obviously Ryan's going to be incredibly busy with his demining work for the next, a couple of months. But hopefully we'll reach out and we'll try and get him to come and chat with us again, and we can hear all about how the project has gone.
Absolutely, that'd be amazing.
All right. And so I think at this point, guys, what we're going to do is move into some of our usual updates on the war in Ukraine. And I'm going to start with the material, some updates on the progress of the offensive to consider. Then we'll move into the Black Sea, and then some updates on the fallout from the Wagner air crash and its investigation. And we have maybe an hour and a half available to us. So we'll see how much we can get through. To that end, I've put some materials up in the nest. And as usual, the first item I've included is our list of maps from some of the regular sources. The reason I do this is while I'll discuss some of the progress in the offensive, I tend to look at overall themes or speculation about what may come in the near future. There are lots of accounts that do amazing work looking at the details of progress on the front line. The reason I include these maps is I think it's helpful to look at a variety of sources. They have their own networks for collecting information. They may differ slightly. Some of them include unit positions, some don't. So you can get a sense of a broader picture. And in addition to the maps themselves, I'll highlight that Andrew Perpetua, who is kind enough to co-host with us today, will also do a walkthrough on YouTube. He does that twice a week. And so he takes his map and screen shares it and then speaks to the changes, which is, super insightful. And he does those talks on Thursday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And then on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And then Fridays at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So I'd encourage you to check those out if you want a deep dive into the state of the front line. And so the second point in the nest, just as an overview, every week there are several overviews that get published. It's hard to cover them all. In this case, I've chosen one by the Lookout, who does great work, OSINT work, mainly naval, here on Twitter. And he is doing this in two parts. He wants to, in this first part, he's covering the progress of the offensive to date. And then in part two, he's going to jump into where he sees it going, likely outcomes of the offensive. And I don't think part two is out yet. I didn't see it. But if you're curious on where things are, how we got to this point, check out his analysis, and then it might prime you to read his part two. So these next couple of items, they're a little bit speculative. I probably should have considered these points before realizing that Andrew would be co-hosting with me, so he can correct me on any of these. Usually I try not to get ahead of the situation, but these are some fairly reliable accounts. And so that third item in the nest is a tweet by Defmon. And he is noting, this is speculation from Russian accounts, but because of the successes around Robotin by Ukraine, which captured that last week, I think Wednesday or Thursday it was, there has continued to be progress in the region, particularly to the east of the city. And this Russian speculation that Defmon is referring to are potential pushes on Kopani and Verbov. And that would be, widening the front. And you can also see on Defmon's map, drawn in are the lines of defense. So you get a sense of them expanding sort of, and not merely just trying to push straight through the second line. But on that front of the second defensive line, the fourth item in the nest, the tweet from P-Style 1, and P-Style 1 does a lot of reporting on info from Russian Telegram. Again, speculative, not completely confirmed. There apparently are reports that the Ukrainians may have taken a critical height that is between the cities of Verbov and Novoprokopivka. And the idea being that by controlling that height, they will have, a great position to launch attacks on both of those points. I will caution when I say that these items are speculative. There was discussion as long ago as last Wednesday, Thursday, that the Russians may have retreated behind their defensive lines and that they may have abandoned Novoprokopivka, but that turns out not to have been the case. Ukraine hasn't been able to just advance straight into it. So it's just a reminder that, supporters of Ukraine can get really enthusiastic, and sometimes these reports are well ahead of events on the ground. The fifth item back, tweet from Kyle Glenn. And I just like this approach. We've seen it done before. I haven't seen it applied quite as often lately. But what Kyle's done is overlaid FIRMS data, which is the infrared data from a U.S. satellite that is often taken to detect fires. And usually it's assumed that a number of those fires are connected with fighting, shelling that has ignited them. And so he's overlaid this around that portion of the front line. And you can see that it does support the idea that the Ukrainians may be working to push out to the east toward Verbov. But again, I just like this idea of taking multiple sources of information and overlaying them together. Switching to a little bit different front, the sixth item in the nest is from Defmon. And this is more confirmed. There is geolocation data that shows that Ukraine has begun to push into the city of Klishivka, which is just to the south of Bakhmut. And there was a period probably 3 to 4 weeks ago where the rate of progress around the flanks of Bakhmut was quite rapid. It's slowed on that front somewhat, but advancing into into Klishivka, which is to the south, is good progress at continuing to push the fighting on those flanks. And we can potentially have a bit of a back and forth debate because there were reports, for example, that the United States and other allies may have been speaking to the Ukrainians and suggesting that it is more critical for them to push on the Zaporizhia front, and that this front around Bakhmut is not as strategically significant, which may contribute to why progress on those flanks, having been rapid, has slowed a little bit. But it still seems like they're making slow but steady progress. And then finally, moving up further to the northeast, we've known for weeks that the Russians have been pressing a little bit in the Luhansk region, sort of on the Kupiansk-Lyman line. And I just want to note that it came up in the news again today that Ukrainian military spokesperson had come out to repeat this number, that the Russians have 100,000 troops or so in that area. I know when the number came out a few weeks ago, there was discussion about how, 100,000 personnel doesn't translate to 100,000, combat on the front line, and perhaps it's overstating the impact. There was also the argument that that number has been in the area for quite a while now, but I raise it just because it seems like the Russians are continuing to try to push in that area in an effort to distract the Ukrainians, to try to force them to move defenders up to that region and away from where they're making some successes now along the Zaporizhia lines. So I'll put up my next block of materials. If anybody on the panel wants to jump in for a moment while I'm putting that up, feel free, but otherwise just bear with me.
Piotr, go for it.
Yeah, so the pronunciation is, I was practicing this earlier, it's Nova Provokivka, as far as I can get it right. So if that helps. It's quite hard.
Yeah, first, congratulations. And second, because it's really hard to say, I just wanted to say that there were some geolocated footage today of Ukraine advancing near Rivnopil. So that's pretty exciting, I guess. There was this little kind of appendix that stuck up near Rivnopil between the Priutny and Staromayorsky. And this little appendix appears to be to have either disappeared or is about to disappear. So that's a little advance that I don't think many people are talking about.
So Andrew, I've got another question actually, if Michael's still putting things.
Yep.
But
Yep, go ahead.
Thank you. What do you have any insights on because I'm a little bit behind. That's why I like jumping in on a Sunday to keep up with what's going on the tactical level. But the Ukrainians that landed in Crimea, I don't know if you can elaborate on that, enlighten me, because I'm behind on the details of that.
Well, I'm not sure there really are details. They kind of showed up. They did something. I don't know really what. They raised a flag, which was for the flag day that they had there, and then maybe connected, or maybe not connected at all. those S-400s blew up right next to where they landed. We don't know if that's related. Maybe they blew them up. Who knows? Actually, we kind of know it. They didn't, don't we? But anyways, they may have been connected to that. But other than that, I have no idea.
So some friends of ours interested in that looked at some radar sites and some other targets in that area, and they didn't see very much in the way of damage that was significant enough to be visible on satellite. And so it's possible that that landing, whether it was symbolic or whether it was recon based, that there wasn't significant destruction associated with it. But we're keeping an eye on it.
It's possible they were flying drones.
Right. There have been several reports of some of the attacks taking place, deep behind Russian lines, being launched from nearer the airports, as in on Russian territory, whether partisans or special forces. And so it's possible they landed to carry out the same thing. But I'll keep rolling with a couple of updates. So a moment ago, I was speaking to the Russian effort on that Kupiansk-Lyman line to press in an effort to draw Ukrainian defenders away from the Zaporizhia line. Interestingly, if you look at the first item in the nest, it's a tweet from Rob Lee. He is putting some analysis over an observation made by DEFMON about apparently based on patches taken from casualties. It looks like the VDV 76th Air Assault Division, which is a Russian paratrooper unit that's reportedly quite elite, appears to have been moved away from the Crimea front and down to defend along the southern line, suggesting that if there's this tug of war between Ukraine and Russia, to say Russia's saying, well, we want the fighting to be focused in the northeast, and Ukraine's saying we want the fighting to be focused in the south, that Russia is yielding and it's beginning to move some reinforcements from the northeast down to defend in the south. And lots of people added commentary on this. I think Tatarigami, in discussing it, noted just because you see some elements of the 76th having been moved to that front doesn't mean that the entire unit has been moved. But others, have also made the point that the 76th, being one of the more elite units, means that they are not available as a reserve to respond. As in, now that they have been committed, that means that it may imply that Russia doesn't have quite as deep reserves to respond because they've had to commit some of them. And a moment ago, when we were talking about movement around Verbov and that region, and we talked about the Ukrainians potentially widening that thrust along the second defensive line. To get a better understanding of what the defensive lines are, the second tweet in the nest is by DEFMON, and he has a couple of graphics in this thread. I appreciated this one because sometimes when you look at the mapping that is quite literal, where are the trenches, you don't maybe get a sense of where are the areas that are likely mined. Sometimes there are a couple of trench lines that are quite close to one another, but they're not exactly in a line. So I like this graphic that DEFMON put together showing how really these defensive regions have a bit of width to them, and you get a better sense of where the Ukrainians have pressed through the first line and are now encountering the second. So I thought that was a particularly helpful graphic. The third item I wanted to raise, this is from George Barrows, who is one of the analysts at the Institute for the Study of War, is when we talk about they're approaching the second line, as of yesterday, they're now apparently within 2.5 kilometers of the Great Anti-Vehicle Ditch, which is one of the primary elements of that defensive line. So they're almost right on it. And this is a day ago, so it's entirely possible that Ukraine may already be working to breach these lines. When you sit on Twitter long enough, you'll see claims that they have already made progress past the line. But until at least for my sake, until I start to see some geolocated video or photos. It seems like they're now right on top of that line. And George's tweet also included a photo that shows that it's a complex once again. So there's this significant anti-vehicle ditch. Then there's a gap. There are likely mines. Then there are sort of infantry-sized trenches. There are those dragon's teeth that were probably rightly criticized as being partly for show, but they will present a little bit of a hurdle. So that's the line that the Ukrainians are now going to have to surmount. And so I also made a reference a moment ago to the suggestion that Ukraine has gotten some advice, or it's reported that Ukraine got some advice from the United States and the UK that they should emphasize their push on the southern lines, essentially de-emphasizing their pushes around Bakhmut. And so this fourth item back in the nest is one of the articles on this from The Guardian. And it sounds like there may have been a series of meetings. I know there was I think it was a New York Times article that talked about a meeting between these leaders August the 10th, where sort of the same message was initially delivered. Now it sounds like there are ongoing meetings. And interestingly, some people have highlighted that it seems like the UK, I believe he's Admiral Radican, sounds like he is increasingly a point of contact to sort of pass along Western, strategic advice to the Ukrainians. And it's some reports make it sound like he has gained their trust and is having some success in being influential in passing along suggestions about where to focus most effectively. Exit, please go ahead.
I actually wanted to hear if Andrew had some thoughts about this particular point.
Well, I disagree with what they're saying, and one. Okay, so one reason why is that we now see pretty good evidence that Russia is withdrawing forces from around Kupiansk and sending them down to the south. And I think we're going to see them increasingly draw forces to the south as Ukraine has more progress, especially if they have this progress in different areas, like if they take Staromonivka and continue south on that axis as well. So they would then be progressing towards Volnovakha, perhaps, or Domok, in addition to their current progress towards Tokmak. So with these increasing movements of troops to the south, it weakens the Russian lines in other areas, and if you commit everything to the south, then you will not be able to take advantage of those weakened lines in other areas.
Right. So you would just be an advocate for sort of a maintaining some strategic ambiguity, some actual potential to shift emphasis to keep the Russians on their toes. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Okay. And so I tend to put ideas to get these blocks together sort of on themes. The last point in this theme, which was about decision making, where to allocate forces. If you have a look at the first item in the nest, with regard to Ukrainian decision making centers, I think it was a little over a week ago, I highlighted in one of our discussions that there had been renewed speculation about the potential that Defense Minister Reznikov may be replaced, which was hearkening back to a discussion which, it wasn't just rumor, there was sort of public discussion about it several months ago, maybe 3-4 months ago, suggestion that he may be moved to the Minister of Justice, suggestion he may be made an ambassador. Others may be shuffled in his place, with speculation potentially about Intelligence Chief Budanov. Interestingly, yesterday it was reported by the Kiev Independent that Reznikov has said that he would resign if there were indications that there is some merit or substance to allegations that when the Defense Ministry tried to procure winter clothing, what wound up happening was they were delivered only summer clothing, and that there was no pushback in an effort to get the right equipment that had been requested. And now it's not clear to me if the allegation is incompetence or whether there's an element of corruption. But the earlier speculation about Reznikov potentially being moved was in connection with a scandal regarding the price of food being purchased for the military being overpriced. There was no suggestion that Reznikov was involved in that corruption. But, when he's in charge of the department, it was prompting some speculation. Given there's this new scandal, he has now said he would be open to resign if it turns out that, there's substance to it. Meaning that, odds are higher that this shuffle that has been anticipated now for several months may come to pass. The next block of material is on some strikes behind Russian lines. And we spoke, I can't even remember if it was Thursday or a week ago, about attacks on Russian air bases, Salt Sea and others, some of which had resulted in, there was destruction of a Tu-22 bomber. The Ukrainians claimed they had affected 5 different bombers over the course of several attacks in a few days. There was a report just this morning coming from a Ukrainian intelligence source, and I think most outlets that reported on it, again, it wasn't a public press conference. It was reported as an intelligence source, so it's not 100% confirmed. But that there was an attack by the Ukrainians on the Kursk air base. And the claims are that several Russian planes were affected. It's being reported potentially 5. We don't know how severe that is. I'll note that, for example, with the Salt Sea attack, it was reported that 2 planes had been damaged. Evidence has turned out to show that 1 bomber was definitely destroyed. It's not clear that a second was actually affected. And so, again, that number 5, take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But interestingly, this third item back, there are claims. So the Russians were saying that a huge number of drones were sent last night by the Ukrainians. And in that second item, where the Ukrainian intelligence source is speaking, they were saying that it was, I think they said 15 or 16 drones, of which a very small number were stopped, and all of the others made it, close to or to their targets. I think the Russians had floated a number, something like 40 total drones in use. This third item was a claim that perhaps the high number of drones may be made possible because they may be using drones essentially made out of cardboard that's coated, and therefore they're quite inexpensive to produce and can be sent in much larger numbers. But I'll pause. Andrew, you had your hand up. Did you want to come in with a point?
So there were these comments this morning about the drone attack on the airport. And maybe I'm looking at the wrong airport, but today I looked at some satellite imagery of the airport, and I didn't see any evidence of strikes there.
Well, thanks for that. I know there are going to be a lot of eyes looking to check. Nukes, go ahead.
So I just wanted to comment on the cardboard drones. I guess I can go ahead and comment. We've looked at several of these sites too, bought satellite imagery for them, and the only confirmations I've seen so far were the S-400 tel there near Mayak. Was that Oleniska, something like that? Sorry for the pronunciation. And then, of course, the one Tu-22. As far as the cardboard drones, though, I just wanted to give a quick comment on that. I have actually built autonomous vehicles using that foam board, cardboard, whatever you want to call it. It's typically a paper-covered foam that is kind of plastic impregnated, and it's actually a very good material. So I know it may look look like something that's kind of amateur, but you can crank those things out in a hurry. All of that foam comes flat packed. So getting it in country, cutting it out with a either pre-perforated or using like a CNC or a laser cutter to cut it, I could see the scaling of that just, blowing up in a huge way. No pun intended there, but I mean, this is something you could scale in mass if they get all the other components worked out. I can find the button.
Well, that's interesting background, and that's partly why I decided to include it. The claim was that even though the effects of the strike weren't confirmed, just the idea that this may have been one of the first where use of the sort of cardboard or foam board drones have been used is interesting all on its own. And so we'll just have to, maybe hold our judgment on how successful the raid was until some additional satellite imagery comes available, to Andrew's point that we're not yet seeing damage sort of on the scale that's being reported of multiple planes being affected. But I will just make the point that sometimes when you have damage to these systems, it's spectacular, like the Tu-22 burning down. In other cases, there was an instance where some partisans in Belarus managed to land a drone on the radome of, what is it, an A-22, like their the Russian sort of
A-50.
A-50, sorry about that, the A-50. Their ELINT sort of battlefield coordination aircraft, and when it detonated, it damaged it, but there was some video of it taking off, and it wasn't completely evident. And so sometimes critical systems can be damaged where you wouldn't see it on satellite.
Yeah, and that airplane has never been seen again so far.
Yeah, that's a good point, Sam. And I appreciate that there are people who will track these things for months. They'll look for this aircraft was damaged. They know its registration numbers, and then they look to see if it's been brought back into use. So continuing on the theme of air matters, the fourth item, I just wanted to acknowledge, I'm sure most of you saw that there was a tragic accident during training where I think the pilots were flying L-39s, which are trainer aircraft. 3 were killed. It sounds like one of them may have been a trainer, and the others were, recertifying or sort of, completing a training period. Their names are included in this article from the Kyiv Independent. There's, ground footage of the wreckage and so on if you wanted to get into the OSINT side of it. But I chose, I don't think it's necessary to include it here. In particular, one of them was a famous pilot who went by the call sign Juice and had been a great advocate for Ukraine to obtain F-16s and other advanced fighters. And obviously his death is tragic. All of their deaths are, and the timing is also, tragic, given that it sounds like Ukraine now be maybe just months away from receiving the first of those F-16s. So I didn't want to let that pass without acknowledging it. Because I like new, quantifiable aspects of things, the fifth item, carrying on, was in an interview, a Ukrainian Air Force spokesperson gave an update on the number of combat sorties that have been flown by their Air Force, and at the moment the count is at 14,000 sorties, of which approximately 6,000 ground attack and approximately 7,000 air-to-air, or whether those be combat air patrols or escorts, which is an incredible number given the predictions early on that the Ukrainian Air Force would not survive very deep into the war. It speaks to their, adaptability, tenacity. But I always like tracking to understand levels of activity and the like. Let's see here. And then again, on the quantifiable front, the sixth item back, occasionally I'll include the table that Nalcio does on vehicle losses in connection just with the offensive. I didn't see an update from him in the last day or two, but I suspect he'll put one out again soon. in its place, I found this table. The tweet is by Django, and he's done a table where he looked at the number of significant Western systems that have been donated to Ukraine and their loss rates. And you'll see that for the most part, it's sort of hovering in the 10% range. But it's, just an interesting way to slice the data. And he relied on Oryx's project for loss tracking, and Oryx retweeted it. So, I take that as a bit of a seal of approval if he's willing to put it out there again. Okay, this next set of material is some items that I intend might generate a little bit of a debate. Some of them are some analysis, some of them are a little bit controversial. So just bear with me 1 minute while I get these put together. There are two more. The first, there was a tweet put out by, and it was just taken as an example by several people. It was a tweet that was put out by GeoConfirmed, who do terrific work in aggregating, geoconfirmations, mostly from very dedicated volunteers. Many of them, drop in to listen to our conversations. And, but this was an analytical piece, and what it said was, well, Ukraine can also achieve a measure of success if their offensive moves far enough south that they can then take fire control over the land bridge to limit Russian movement through it. And, that would be a success as well. What I chose was one of the pieces that took that and responded to it with a bit of a critique. So that's the first tweet in the nest by John Helen. John, does OSINT work on Twitter, and he's just making the point that this is an argument that is being made by several people, the idea of fire control, and that fire control doesn't have nearly the same degree of control over territory as actually holding it with infantry, and armor. And he's suggesting that there were a lot of people who at the beginning of the offensive were talking about pushing to the Sea of Azov, in this year and completely cutting it and occupying that territory. And he's suggesting that this increasing shift to focusing on fire control is a bit of moving the goalposts. Now, he's not critical. Obviously, John wants Ukraine to succeed as much as is possible, but that, it should be acknowledged that it's sort of a second best outcome relative to actually taking the territory, and that it will have different implications for what Russia is able to do in terms of movement of logistics into the winter. And so I wanted to put this out here so that you can start thinking for yourself about, number one, the implications of potentially, building up high expectations for the offensive to begin with, whether that was wise, that Ukraine still has potential to make a breakthrough, but to start thinking about, if we are now coming into September and there are, a month and a half, maybe 2 months before weather starts to shift and affect the ability to move at the same pace, what's realistic? Do we think the Ukrainian offensive will push toward the city of Tokmak, which is particularly heavily fortified? How far south do the Ukrainians need to get? Not only so that things like Gimlers fired by HIMARS can be potentially used for fire control all the way to the Sea of Azov, but realistically, you need to support that fire control with recon and the maximum range of an artillery system and its regular, accurate, sort of effective range are a little bit different. And so you can't just take a map and take the maximum range of a piece of artillery and say, well, if they get this close, then they can control it. So there's nuance to all of that, which John gets into in this thread. But I see that's at least generated a hand. So we'll go to Skate Park.
Yeah, thanks. So this has come up as a sort of debate, but there are some people who have talked about fire control for a while. And as you say, if you want to hit something that can be moved, like a truck or something, you need observation, and you also, of course, you need to have your own platform that is firing this close enough to hit it, which also means exposing it to the Russians. So, of course, there is a dilemma here. But just one thing I would say is that the Russians do move some things by truck, but when it comes to the railways, it's very interesting to look at the railway map of southern Ukraine, because if you look at the railway going out from the city of Donetsk and through the west, it passes pretty close by Vuhledar, and there it's in range of both actually mortar and tank fire and artillery. So it seems that if the Russians are moving supplies up by rail, they would have to move it through Crimea, either by first moving it into Crimea by ship or moving it across the Kerch bridge. Of course, if the Kerch bridge is taken out, they also have railway ferries, so they are always alternatives. But one of the themes here is that if the Ukrainians are able to make the Russians expend ammunition faster than they can supply it, then the Russians will have to start rationing ammunition. So that it's sort of war is dilemmas. So, but Mike, if anyone knows here in the space, do you have any sort of idea of if Russia has been able to move away from their dependence on railway logistics? Because it seems like in the start of the war, their units were very light in logistics. They had much fewer transport trucks than a Western unit would have, because they were so dependent on railway. But the Russians can learn during the war. So have you seen if they have been able to correct this sort of imbalance in logistics?
Well, that's a great question. I know use of railway versus road transport has been discussed a couple of times. I mean, even quite early on, in March, April of last year, I had some discussions. You guys probably know Trent Telenko, the guy who focuses a lot on logistics and literally tires, about how lots of the outlets that would track, so particularly there's a publication called The Military Balance that tracks equipment in essentially every country in the world, that's taken usually as one of the most authoritative sources, but that they wouldn't track numerically the trucks and logistics. And so I don't know that anybody has developed a reliable quantitative estimate of these things. Occasionally you'll see thoughtful threads, by Tatarigami and others, who will highlight the impact on increasing the logistical chain, by having to put store warehouses and so on further from the front line to protect them against, gimlers and so on. And the burden that places on fuel and wear and tear on trucks. But again, those usually don't come with numbers. So I would be just as interested as you are, Malhus, to see if anybody has sort of quantifiable ways to say, yes, the Russians are definitely relying on these more than they have in the past. Go ahead, Andrew.
I don't know how their reliance on trains is currently. It's probably pretty high, but I can tell you one thing. Russia is destroying entire trade lines in a matter of a day or two with artillery. And this takes a tremendous amount of shelling to accomplish. And if they were having a logistical problem, they would not be able to do this. We're talking thousands and thousands of rounds fired into a few trees. It's insane amounts of ammunition that they're using every single day. I mean, I can't give you an estimate on how many shells, but it's a lot. It's like a lot. So I think any claim that their logistics are flawed or not working or there's something wrong, I think is just not accurate, because they have the ability to bring incredible amounts of ammo to the front and fire it.
Related to that, I'll jump ahead in the items in the nest for just a moment. But if you have a look at the fourth item back, the thread from Tatarigami. So, to Andrew's point about the Russians apparently don't have a logistics problem at the moment. But the idea of the Russian ability to adapt and the potential for, Russian opponents, Ukrainian supporters, to underestimate Russia is, potentially significant. So this item in the nest from Tatarigami, it's actually a thread that was written by, you'll see the account handle there, Solonko 1648. So it was written by this Ukrainian soldier in Ukrainian. Tatarigami's just put up the English translation, where in his thread, he talks a lot about the Russian ability to adapt, and essentially that people may be underestimating their successes and just the depth of their reserves. And that kind of goes along with the point Andrew was making. So I'm only highlighting it so that if you want to get, I wouldn't say that it's an opposing view or like a counter view, but that it's an important piece of context coming from somebody who sees it every day. So I'd encourage you to check out that thread. Colby, go ahead.
Thanks. Kerch Bridge got hit for the first time in October, and the Russians withdrew from Kherson in November. Now, I don't recall if there's been any reporting or open source analysis about when the Russians actually might have made that decision to withdraw, but certainly losing the Kerch Bridge, both road and rail, obviously played an impact in that decision because it just made it all that more difficult to get supplies to the front. So it is just a truism in war that there is no substitute for railways. The capacity that railways provide for moving men, material, supplies is unrivaled compared to trucks or anything else. So if the Russians lose rail logistics, it doesn't matter how many trucks they have. It's vastly less efficient. How big of a problem would it be? Well, it depends on how big of a problem, I guess it is. It's a difficult thing to quantify, but even the United States with its vast logistical network would struggle if they couldn't use rail at all. If they had to just move everything by truck and by air and they couldn't use a single railway, that would be a pretty big problem for them. And the United States is obviously very well equipped in the logistics domain in terms of all the palletization and everything that has gone into ensuring that the frontline soldier is well equipped, all the lessons that they've learned from the Second World War and on, stuff that the Russians didn't learn. It's not really learning isn't the issue. It's a question of whether it's efficient or not to move things by truck instead of rail, and it definitely isn't. So the Russians will have a difficult time, I would say, if the Kerch Bridge goes down again, or other key rail bridges are destroyed and can be kept destroyed and not easily repaired. It would cause headaches for them for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that impact varies depending on the geography, though. And so, the impact in Kherson was partly because, they had to ultimately get it across the river. Geography plays such a huge role in the decision-making, of the commanders, in that working toward the approaches of Crimea, it has a whole bunch of strategic implications. This may also be, when we talked earlier about how the Russians are pushing in the northeast, that may be partly as a distraction. But if you think about the idea, the Russians could have taken those forces and just had stronger defenses in the south. It contributing to the Russian decision to try to push in the northeast may be the closer the proximity to the Russian border, the harder it is to consistently interdict their logistical lines. And so they can push there more consistently or at lower risk than in the south. And so absolutely, when you say if they take the Kersh Bridge out, it's just a question of we're not in that world yet. And of course, we're all watching pretty closely, thinking that will be a logical step we'll hope to see soon. Nukes, go ahead.
Well, I had kind of a hypothetical question here, and this may be something that is impossible to answer, or the answer may be, just a educated guess, if anything, and I'm fine with that. As the battle progresses towards the Azov, are they going to be in a better position for logistics due to ships crossing? Or are they going to be in a worse position? I mean, assuming the railways are cut off one way or another, with pockets towards the Azov or something that happens to the bridge, whatever. I guess my question is it going to get better before it gets worse for Russia until those ports and offloading areas along the Azov become within HIMARS and then tube artillery range? Or are we talking ships are just bad logistically because of the time it takes? I'm just wondering about that, if anybody knows.
I'll toss a couple of points in to consider, including, and a lot of these are points that have been discussed over the last year, so apologize if I'm repeating some of them. Some of the port infrastructure in those cities was badly damaged. Some of the port areas were mined. The Russians had to undertake a process to repair and demine them if they wanted to make them useful. As well, the Sea of Azov is quite shallow compared with the Black Sea. And so the draft and therefore the capacity of ships as a transit method is a little bit reduced to the extent that's a relevant factor. I have seen use of ferries to be moving some armored vehicles in the Sea of Azov, but I haven't seen very many reports lately on heavy use of them just for general logistical supply. But others, we've got a bunch of hands up, so I'm going to defer to those guys. I think the order was Malhus, Colby, and then Z. Goldman. Go ahead, Malhus.
Yeah, if you look at the railway map, of course, the railway isn't everything. They can use trucks too, but the port of Berdyansk is possible to use to move supplies across the Azov. The only problem, one of the dilemmas for the Russians there is that if they use big ships to move supplies, that suddenly becomes a high-value target that might be worth sending a Storm Shadow against, because if you hit that ship, you don't just destroy the supplies, you can also destroy the ship and the port infrastructure and make it a block ship. So it's possible, but I think it's actually quite high risk for the Russians to do that.
Which we saw actually a landing ship. I believe it was in the port of Berdyansk. I can't remember when, April or May of last year, that was struck and sunk. So clearly the Ukrainians can do it. If they can do it once, they can do it again. Go ahead, Colby.
I haven't seen any analysis of how much tonnage of supplies is actually coming in through these ports rather than going over land. So if anybody has seen any analysis of that, I'd be very interested in seeing it. I'll just say that it goes without saying that as the Russians fall back, their supply lines get shorter, which is an advantage because they're fighting closer to their border. They're fighting closer to their main supply hubs. So that in theory, that helps them. Although the question that we're debating here is, what is Ukraine's ability as they gain more territory to interdict those supply routes that are currently out of range? So when Ukraine brings the main highway that runs from Mariupol to Berdyansk to Melitopol, as that comes into range, what's their capacity to interdict supplies that are moving along that roadway? So while the Russians are closer to those supplies, can Ukraine bring effective fires down? And that's the question, right? And Geo Confirmed was kind of suggesting that that they can do it, and others are saying not so fast. There's a lot of different factors that go into this beyond just drawing a line on the map and saying this is the maximum range of Gimlers. Oh, it's in range, we can hit it, right? So I would just keep that in mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Colby. Inspired by Nuke's question and Colby's question about, Nuke's question about the ships and Colby's question about not being sure of the total tonnage that needs to be moved, reminded me of a recent thread on, supplying a force across a water break. And so if any of you guys start to see reports from any big accounts here on Twitter that the Russians have built a pontoon bridge across the Sea of Azov, pass that along to me because I would find that fascinating. Z. Goldman, go ahead.
That was pretty funny. I focus on the things that are coming that haven't shown up on the battlefield yet. And GDLSB, when it arrives, nominally in the fall, should change all of this that we're talking about. And that's something with range that would put everything along the Sea of Azov in range. And it should be able to come in sufficient quantity that it should make a difference. Now, you still need the intelligence, you still need all the other stuff. But when that shows up, and that's one of those things that's inbound, I'm waiting for the day when we have an unexplained thing that blows up. That should change the dynamic pretty significantly. And nominally, that's the fall. That's what the promise was. A lot of this might change. There's a couple things, just to mention the other thing I'm waiting for to show up on the battlefield. Last week, the Ukrainian Air Force put a photo of, an SU-27 being outfitted with JDAMs. And if you know, the Su-27 is a long-range airplane when you compare it to like the MiG-29, which is where JDAMs are currently being used. Su-27s are a precious asset for Ukraine because there are no friendly countries that own them, so they don't have like a stock like MiGs like they do for MiGs where they could depending on other nations to supply either spare parts or aircraft. So Su-27s are kind of a precious asset. They might have 30 of them. If you look at Wikipedia, I think I know a better number. I don't want to say anything different. But why would Ukraine put a JDAM on a long-range aircraft unless they planned on using it, especially a precious asset like Su-27? So those are the two things I'm looking for to change, kind of change the game changers that are inbound that we haven't seen yet.
Those are great points. A few things they inspire. I don't know how much time we'll have to get into updates on Ukrainian equipment. There was speculation that the Ukrainians may have received, I'm going to get the designation wrong, but I think the GBU-31 up to the 2,000-pound bomb. It's not certain that's true, but that kind of goes along with the idea of, additional sort of heavy munitions on their aircraft. There was also speculation that the Netherlands may be providing air-launched AGM-84, the Harpoons. So it sounds like the Ukrainian Air Force may get a lot more lethal fairly soon. Interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say there is a third thing, not to wonk out on people, but the Polish MiG-29s that were given to Ukraine have been upgraded to kind of a Western infrastructure with a 1553 data bus, and we have, that Poland has given those aircraft to Ukraine a while ago, and we haven't seen evidence of them, in battle. But if there's any aircraft that Ukraine owns currently that's going to show up with some Western avionics or Western missiles on it, it would be those MiGs, because they have the infrastructure that could accept some of it. So that's kind of the three things I'm looking for that kind of change the game. And yeah, the bigger bombs is good. The interesting one is the longer range. When you compare the range of a Su-27 to a MiG-29, it's over twice the range. So why would you put a JDAM on something that goes twice as far unless you planned on bombing things twice as far away?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'll note also to your other point about the ground-launched small diameter bombs, when they arrive, may change the game. Interestingly, the thread from John Helen, which is I think now the third item in the nest that I spoke to, about fire control versus seizing the territory. He started that thread by saying, should the Ukrainians consider just waiting for the arrival of the GLSDB because that will change the environment?
Okay,
which is
I didn't catch that. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I got on late and missed that.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I didn't highlight it, but it's just interesting that it's a discussion that several people are having about, maybe don't push until you have the tools to enable the push.
Yep. So that will double the range from Gimlers, right? And then you're talking about JDAMs with double the range when you put it on a long-range aircraft, right? So they're preparing for a long-range war right now, and that's interesting to me because when you start seeing air defense systems being taken out allegedly in Crimea, you know what I mean? You think that you might see a war coming in from over the Black Sea into Crimea. It seems like that's not something that we should be surprised might happen.
There are a lot of things on the horizon, metaphorically and hopefully soon, literally, in terms of the long-range fight. To that end, I don't know if we'll have time to get to it, so I put up as the first item in the nest the block of material I have that speak to the GBU 31 discussion and the AGM 84 discussion, just so you guys don't have to go digging for sources. And then to support your comments, Exit had put up from a couple of days ago that video of the JDAM ER, the first picture of it. So it's there for people as a source. Nukes, go ahead.
Well, I have two questions. One's really specific to what was just spoke about. The other one's kind of a broader question. Specifically on the Polish MiG-29s with the 1553 bus, do they have Western radar warning receivers? That's the first question. And is that interfaceable with HARM? Second question would be, how are the indigenous drone programs like the Bober and the new car drones, and I know there's a French project to make an indigenous cruise missile. How are those comparing to Western equipment? I mean, they seem to be less expensive and being built in mass. It's just taking time, but it seems like they're starting to catch up. So is that capability going to be something that runs alongside of the Western equipment, or do we foresee it overtaking it on some of these strikes, just being used more and more and more just because of the sheer mass of these that they're starting to acquire?
Well, it does seem like, so there was, I'll grab the article in a moment, but there was a discussion about, sending systems where the systems are incredibly impressive versus sending systems that we can make in huge mass, right? Even from the Western Allies' perspective. And so it seems like that's increasingly the idea that is in the air, and that the Ukrainians may have seized on it as well, as you note with all those projects. If people have specific insight into how those weapon development programs are running for the Ukrainians, we can perhaps discuss. I just suspect that we don't have insight into their specific cost mix versus Western systems, how far along they are, until the Ukrainians do start fielding them en masse. So that's why I found that suggestion of the attack on the Kursk air base so interesting, because it suggests that the Ukrainians may be deploying those cardboard, foam board drones in their dozens now, suggesting they're a little further along. And then there was also the knockoff, which I don't use dismissively, but the copy of the Lancet that the Ukrainians have developed. I believe it's called the Perrin, if I'm not mistaken. And so it seems like the Ukrainians are definitely pushing in that less expensive direction. With regard to the radar warning and the HARM integration, I suspect Z. Goldman may be the best person to answer that question, so we'll go to him.
Yeah, that's theoretically what I'm thinking about. I mean, HARM is integrated already, but it's not fully functional when the current aircraft. But it's good enough. It's doing the job. So I'm not sure the thing I'm focused on, to be honest with you, is Link 16. So if those aircraft can have a Link 16 added to them, all the ground-based air defense systems that the West has provided to Ukraine are all Link 16 compatible. And what that means is that they can all share radar data and targeting data with each other when you're on the Link 16 network. So, the big problem with the MiGs are they have a severe range disadvantage from their radar. But when you add Link 16 to that MiG, it can then benefit from all other Link 16 capable elements, that are in Ukraine's inventory to kind of mitigate some of that disadvantage. So I'm looking for Link 16 to be the thing that kind of changes the dimension when you talk about those aircraft, or putting a Western missile, maybe an AMRAAM or something like that, and the ability of Link 16, with the Link 16 and AMRAAM, you could actually pass targeting data directly to that missile without ever turning on the radar for those MiGs. If you have if you have another asset with that targeting data. So I would not be surprised if that's what they're trying to do right now with those aircraft, is get some of the Western avionics up into it and some of the situational awareness stuff, like RWRs and Link 16 integrated in those aircraft. It's got two multifunctional displays, so you just have to get the data on board, and the pilot can use it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, seeing that happen will be really interesting, because there was talk about, when some of these aircraft were being turned over in the first place, how they had to have NATO compliant elements or more advanced systems, stripped out of them. And that was partly delaying things. So a change to now build in this integration would definitely represent a shift in the Allies' mindset. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone that these long-range strikes are good, obviously, but the main fight now is fighting these trench systems. So it's not so much hitting targets that are very far away. What Ukraine needs is really big bombs to blow up these trenches. Artillery is not really gonna work here. Gimlers aren't gonna work. It's gonna take really big bombs. We're talking about bunkers. We're talking about tunnels underground, giant minefields, huge trench systems. You need overpressure for this. It can't be done with just artillery shells and rockets and stuff. We're talking at least 2,000 kilogram bombs to blow this stuff up. That's really what we need here.
To that end, it's not on the scale that you were describing, Andrew, but I got a bit of a laugh out of a tweet. I put it up. It hasn't come up yet, but it's a tweet from I Hate Trenches. There, it's appeared for me, Ryan O'Leary, where there's somebody fighting for the Ukrainians who is preparing an improvised explosive device, and he says that the evolution for how big is too big for bunker busting continues. The suggestion being that Ukrainian forces are realizing, if we're going to be, the infantry soldier is going to be having to toss explosives in. These are large developed underground complexes, that more explosive is better. And obviously you're limited in what you can carry as an infantry, but your point about bigger bombs is relevant. And that partly goes to that speculation that Ukraine may have received the GBU-31 2,000-pound bombs, which would be a movement in the right direction. Okay, I just had two last points. I'll just highlight them to you. Won't speak to them much. They're a ways back. They're the 6th and I think 8th items in the nest. So that 6th item was just, we have lots of specialists in weapon systems. We have people who are really deep into various niches. And Andrew does great work with mapping. This tweet is by Sasho Todorov. There are some people who have paid super close attention to the performance of various units this is an aspect of the war that I haven't gotten into in as much detail as I could. And so this may be a dramatic way to do it, but it was a debate that was started on the, which units have really distinguished themselves for the Ukrainians. And this might not be the most academic format for it, but if you wanted an introduction to who's been fighting where or what units should you go and look up some history of to start to learn a little bit about it, it's not the worst place to start. So I thought I would highlight it for that reason. Then the 8th item back, it's a tweet by JD Work, who just noted the irony, given just on Thursday, we talked about Surovkin having been removed from his role as head of the aerospace forces. And now that the Russian lines of defense are being significantly tested, this is the irony of the fact that everybody is now still calling it the Surovkin line. And how will he feel about that being his legacy, given he commanded the Air Force and he probably wasn't like super keen on this line, and he's now been removed from the fight. So it's just an odd situation to have that be his legacy. I'm going to go to Exit as co-host, and then we'll go to Piotr.
I just wanted to give a quick moment for housekeeping. If you're new here and you wanted to tweet out the space and bring it in for other people, or you wanted to find any of the resources that we're putting up in the nest, if you go to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little button there, and that'll take you to the Spaces tweet. You can tweet it out, or you can find all of the replies put down there. They are all the resources, put in the replies down there. Maybe bookmark the tweet, and when you're looking for something later this week, you'll know where to find it. Thank you to Jacoby for sharing them down there. And then if you do want to come up and add to the conversation, there's the request mic button on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Just click that, and I'll take a look. If your account is locked or your DMs are locked, you may have to DM me so that I know that you're able to come up here and I know what your question is.
Thanks for that. I'm not great at reminding people about how we're set up once I do it at the top of the space. So thanks for that. Piotr, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'll be making one more space for you because it's 10 to midnight here, so I will be going out. But thank you very much for the very informative space. Great to meet Ryan, and I wish you a pleasant rest of your weekend if you're in the UK and bank holiday, I suppose. But take care.
Thanks for joining us, Piotr. And again, I mentioned at the top of the space the conversation that Piotr had with Casus Belli on the revolt in Niger, or the coup in Niger. And so again, that's material is in the agenda. So that was a great discussion. So let me see here. I wanted to move on to the next broad topic, which is events in the Black Sea. And so I'm going to just put that material up if you'll bear with me. We didn't have time to discuss it on Thursday because of the Wagner air crash that took up a huge amount of time, and which was actually lucky for us because Exit, who is our resident Black Sea expert, was not able to be with us. So luckily we shifted it forward, and now we can get Exit's input on some of these developments. And so what I wanted to start with, so some of this material is now a couple of days old, but I still think it's worth diving into, is the increased use by the Ukrainians of small boats in the Western Crimean area. So, off Sevastopol and sort of that northwestern Crimean territory. So the initial reports were just with regard to boats, and then a few days later we had the news of this landing on Crimean territory. And so the first item, which should pop up in just a second, is a tweet from Captain Navy, who does pretty good maritime OSINT work. And this was one of the first reports, was the Russians coming out and saying that their Air Force had spotted some small boats and had attacked them. And so you can see in this video, it's a strafing run where the aircraft uses its guns to attack the small boats. And they said, we destroyed them, hurrah for Russia. was their message. However, that's not how the story actually went. If you have a look at the second item, you get some additional video. And this is the Ukrainians' perspective to say, yes, there was an engagement between Russian aircraft and our small boats, but they didn't destroy our boats. And in fact, we also fired a missile back at the jet. And it's not clear if the missile made contact or damaged the aircraft. It doesn't appear to have taken it down, but that the Ukrainians were giving almost, at least as good as they got. And then there was subsequently some additional footage that came out that was actually on the boat. So I included it here. So it's the third item. And in this, it takes a moment to explain, but it's slow motion footage from the boat as it's being strafed by the aircraft in the first video. And you can hear the impacts of rounds. And then in the last 2 or 3 seconds of the video, it looks like one round comes very close to the boat, maybe striking the frame. And then a second round splashes in the water beside it, but that was the extent of the damage. So it's amazing to see everything from the attacking aircraft's view to a recon drone that's up showing the missile launch and response, and then firsthand footage from the boat itself. This truly is a brave new world of war footage. Go ahead, Exit.
It's like fascinating that we have all of this footage, and honest to God, you can watch all of it, and half of it is so grainy that you can't really tell what's actually happening in it. And the other half of it doesn't really show with specific evidence what they are saying that it shows. So, it's great. It's amazing that we can see all these things, that people can come back out with statements kind of refuting somebody else. But specifically, the footage that both sides are showing doesn't really demonstrate what they are claiming. And it's another good place to remind ourselves that actually sticking with the evidence that's in front of us and what it actually shows versus the story that's being told kind of beside the evidence. Those are two very different things, and it's important to stick with the evidence as opposed to just what you're kind of hearing that goes along with it.
Sorry, my mic button got stuck there for a second. That's a great point. And to that end, it looks like there was an uptick in Russian defenses as a result. And so I'm moving some things around in the nest. They should be moved up to the front now, but it appeared like in response to this increased traffic of of Ukrainian small boats, that the Russians appear to have responded by increasing their own patrols of their smaller naval craft, apparently as a picket. And that was observed on satellite imagery pulled down by H.I. Sutton, Covert Shores. So it's interesting to see the back and the forth that's going on here. It begs the question whether this sort of naval picket will make it harder for Ukrainian small boats to operate. It remains to be seen. Also, it was noted that these Russian ships appeared for a month or two to have actually diminished activity in the area because of the increase in Ukrainian USV attacks. So it seems like now there's this tension between the Russians being worried about unmanned drones, but then also being worried about the potential for small boat landings. And so they have to decide which risk is greater to them. And it seems like they're going back and forth a little bit on the decision. The second item notes that some of this small boat activity was observed to be taking place around some natural gas drilling platforms that are in the Black Sea. And so there are several platforms. I'll admit off the top of my head, I don't know how many. I know that some have, notoriously were struck by missiles, and one of which was burning for months and months, and I think may still be burning. But others, are intact, and it's unclear how significant a role these are playing. There were also reports a few days ago that the Russians may have struck Snake Island. And so there appears to be an ongoing battle to seize these points. And it's not clear whether these points are being used as launching platforms for missiles or otherwise. There are also, I understand, potentially OPSEC concerns about diving into how Ukraine is using these, but it's being discussed in the media. So I think it's at least worth having a back and forth here. Go ahead, Exit.
It's being discussed in the media, but that particular report actually came from the UK Defence Ministry release this morning, which I just think is interesting that they are noting it specifically because if there are OPSEC concerns, it means that they are probably aware of them and still noting this. Russia hasn't really stopped bombing runs on Snake Island basically since they pulled out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So that was July 17th that they pulled out. So I think the first one was on the 18th. They've been fairly consistently doing that. And I would just say that when we watch all the different stories of the attacks back and forth through the Black Sea in the last month and 10 days now, I think it's becoming pretty obvious that Ukraine may not have a functioning navy to the size of the Black Sea Fleet, but they definitely are causing Russia to change their actions in how they operate in the Black Sea. And they probably have a lot more movement in the Black Sea than we have been aware of in the past. And that Russia is working very hard to try and change that, which probably is a good sign that Ukraine is being effective with whatever actions they are actually doing in the Black Sea. And I think, just generally, that's really impressive from a country that doesn't have a lot of ways to build up that ability at this particular moment and is massively undergunned.
Yeah, great points there. And I will know, talking about discussing things here in the space because they're out in the media, just so you know, there are some things that we see sometimes, particularly in the Black Sea, where we don't discuss them because we don't know what Ukraine is up to. And we're not sure that it's safe to discuss their movements. And so we don't. And that, that's something for everybody to keep in mind. We had a discussion briefly on Thursday about the application of Ukrainian law to disseminating information that could identify the location of combat units. And, so that applies, on land. It also applies on the sea. So I'm just not only noting that we try to be careful about it, but to, say, consider what you're publishing as well. Just to getting the information out there and being first is not worth putting somebody at risk. And usually, better information will come out if you wait just a little while. And I don't think any of us are really in a position where we have to get the information out immediately. Go ahead, Exit.
To that point, I have had discussions this week with a number of people about different things that we know are happening in the Black Sea that we are very strictly not publishing that information. And I've also had discussions with other partners who have talked about people who are publishing information about what's going on, learning to do that in a more responsible way, because there is this idea that working out some of your OSINT work kind of in public can be helpful because it can work as a team effort, which is absolutely true. And I totally encourage that lots of the time. However, I also encourage people to think about what publishing that information right this very second does. even if it's information that's public, delaying it from getting more publication could mean that you're just basically working towards encouraging the safety of the people who are operating inside whatever information you're talking about. And I'm being very vague for very specific reasons, and I apologize if you don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to be opaque about this, but just I think there is more of a conversation to be had publicly about when we withhold information, even if it's just for a couple of hours. For instance, the ships that have been transiting out of Ukraine, the cargo ships, I have been very specific about when I publish that information versus when I hold on to it. And I'm not first on the scene on that kind of reporting information. But it's a very specific reason why I'm doing that. And it aligns with some of the other groups that are publishing that information, because I'm very aware that although it's good to have eyes on that information, it can also be really helpful to keep eyes on it, but wait until it's much more publicized out in the broader arena, just for OPSEC reasons in general.
So this is getting down in the weeds a little bit. But I know we have lots of friends who join us who regularly put out analytical content. 2 points. One is, so you don't know who is viewing your content. And 2 points on that front. One, there are journalists. If you're known to do good work, you will absolutely have journalists taking what you do and publishing based on it without crediting you, which is a separate issue. But if you're ahead of things, if you're incorrect, if you're maybe there's an OPSEC concern, then it suddenly becomes out of your hands. Number two, this is something I think a lot of people don't consider, even if they're sophisticated at the analysis part, is there are people who are reading your work who could be amazing sources to you, but who may be concerned about your discretion. And if you are rushing to publish and that hurts the way people perceive your discretion, you will lose the opportunity to reach out to those people as a source. And I don't think people understand that I totally appreciate that as an analyst, you might be focused on your sensor sources, like, sat imagery, footage from Telegram, whatever it may be, but that as you get more sophisticated and people appreciate the work you do, they will start to give you leads. Those leads will not be forthcoming if people think that you're not careful with what you do, FYI. Because I definitely have been careful at managing relationships, and I have people tell me that about observing others. So we'll go to Skate Park and then Nukes. Go ahead, Skate Park.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. Of course, we've all dealt with people on Twitter who start screaming about OPSEC if we post something that is visible on AIS or on the big Russian Telegram channels, and that's pretty silly. But what you said about working sources, my thinking about Twitter is that if there's anything that is OPSEC relevant, I will not even talk about it in DMs on Twitter, because there's thousands of people who could be reading my Twitter DMs. So I wouldn't even encourage any sources with information to contact me on Twitter. One thing that I've seen that some people could be more careful about is that if they start figuring out, because especially if you watch some activity over a long time, you start getting some expertise in patterns of life, like, for example, how things move in a normal situation, and if you see something weird going on. So what I would say that if you start suspecting that this is something interesting that the Ukrainians are doing, maybe hold back on talking about it in public. That's what I would say about it.
To your point about Twitter DMs, that's partly why many of us maintain connections on Signal as a result. So that's, I think, how several people deal with it. I'm going to, so just before I go to hands, just a reminder that we're over time. I anticipate we're going to go another 20 minutes or so. If anybody who is assisting me has to go, totally cool. Understand that we're in bonus time. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, this topic has been like evolving for me over the past like year and a half, and I've recently, maybe not recently, maybe like it was like 8 months ago, I decided that I will never break a story, and there have been some interesting things that have come as a result of that. There are some people who used to feed me information really often, and ever since I've had this rule, and I don't really talk about it. I just have a rule. I don't post it stories myself. Like I wait for someone else to talk about it first. Ever since then, those people just don't talk to me anymore, and now they're talking to other people, and I see those people posting that information now, and it just I'm pretty sure that those people are psyop type things, or maybe just clout chasers, or some sort of not a good actor. And I think people should look out for that. If you are the sort of person who wants to break stories, there's a good chance that people are taking advantage of you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Aside from that risk, you have to ask if it's worth it to you as well. Because even on the assumption that people who aren't trying to manipulate you, but who are sources, who they want to be feeding whoever's first, you may lose opportunities as well from choosing not to break stories. But it's partly, why are you in this? You know what I mean? And if you want to be doing this kind of work in the long term and be respected, that's a different game than trying to max your exposure. And so I think because of the way I run the conversation, we tend to attract the people who are interested in doing this for a while, and build a reputation, as opposed to the break news folks. So I assume I'm largely preaching to the choir, but that's how I see it break down. Go ahead, Area 51.
Okay, I got to do a mic check. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll give you a prime example of this. And just like you said, it's all about discretion. And when you post something, what I always tell people is go with your gut. Yes, there is this euphoria that overcomes you, especially when, something's really interesting happening. And you have to listen to your gut. And if your gut tells you that something may not be right about what you're posting, listening to your gut, and don't do it. And I'll give you an example. We had an F-18 crash here in the U.S. What was that? Early Friday morning. And so I'm very into aviation, and I know how to utilize resources like Live ATC. And I pulled up the ATC audio, and there was about 5 minutes worth of audio, and I'm listening to it, and the audio gave you a pretty clear picture as to what happened. Like, basically there's no survivors. This plane ran into the ground. And he said, I don't feel good about posting the whole audio, so I'll just put a snippet from air traffic control. And what air traffic control said is that, hey, we lost an aircraft. It's not on radar, but we don't know any more information. So that's what I posted. And literally about 5 minutes later, I got a DM from a lady, and she says, yeah, my sister-in-law's husband, her brother-in-law, is an F-18 pilot doing training in California, and she can't get a hold of the guy. Do you know any more information? And my heart just sunk, and it's like, well, yeah, I do know more information, but it's really not my place to put this information out there, because we really do, at the end of the day, don't know what the status of the pilot is. So best advice I can give you is, just go with your gut. And if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I know that others, particularly when you develop firsthand sources, get access to material that's has a higher likelihood of being disturbing. Like there were people after the crash that killed Juice and the other 2 Ukrainian pilots. There were some who rushed to mention the accident, and then there was a discussion I was engaged in saying, well, what's your source? And they said, well, there was a report on Telegram that got deleted, and I'm writing about it because then I reached out to people firsthand who knew the guy, and they told me he had died. That, while that confirms it, it means you're first. It's also how do you want to use that firsthand personal information? Anyway, go ahead, Nukes.
Yeah, so I cross into this realm all the time. The satellite imagery, I probably post about half of what we purchase. I'd say half, so a quarter of that total would be because it was a non-result or we were looking for something and it didn't pan out. But the other part, we see something and most of the time it ends up getting posted, but we'll just wait. And to be clear, I don't look for Ukrainian positions. I don't buy satellite imagery of the line of control pretty much ever. There have been a couple of instances where we looked for damaged Russian air defense assets that were fairly close to the line, but we, intentionally got a very small area. But I will say, though, yeah, anybody can go buy that imagery. At least anybody in a Western country that, Skywatch or somebody allows you to sign up. The thing is, though, is there's information and there's intelligence. Information is readily available. The internet's full of it. I guarantee you that there are thousands and thousands of documents that are highly classified that are somewhere on the internet right now. But it takes somebody going and finding those documents, putting them together and understanding the puzzle to turn that into intelligence or into a leak or whatever you want to call it, into a news story. And that's what a lot of us do here. We put the puzzle together. So just because it's a public source and that information is out and available doesn't mean that that if you put the pieces together that it can't be damaging. So you have to be very careful there. And I hear it all the time. Well, it was, this data source was publicly available. That data source is publicly available, or anybody could look at that. Well, yeah, they could, but did they? And were the right people watching? I know for a fact, and anybody that has an account with multiple subscribers here, if you go and do a tweet, and in that post, if it's anything important, if it's an interesting story or it's something that hasn't been really talked about, you watch the first, say, 10 likes of your when you get it posted, and just see who they are, because a lot of times, yeah, you've got people that follow your account that have reminders set, but you'll be surprised if you look through that how many of those accounts have 4 followers and it is an obvious bot account. I mean, we're being watched. There's no doubt in my mind, and I assume anybody out there with a bigger account, there are people in the the right places watching what we do. So just watch out. Use your gut and wait. Like I said, and Michael had said, most of us aren't out here to break something, breaking news. And I always say that on my account. And I do like to do the open analysis and the open geolocations, publicly post all of that. But I've done less and less of it lately because it seems like as the war goes on and we've watched long enough that we're starting to understand these patterns of daily movement, things that are unusual. And I don't think, you think that everybody's watching it to this extent, and I guarantee you that's not the case. So just remember that, this is a special bunch of people here that is really paying attention to this conflict in a detailed manner that the vast majority of the world's population is not. So just keep that in mind. That's all I've got.
Hi guys, sorry about that. My system was lagging a little bit there. So that was, I think, a really interesting conversational tangent, and it was good to have that group of people together to add those points in. Because you're all pretty engaged and experienced. I am going to get back to running through developments in the Black Sea. Maybe I'll run 10, 15 more minutes. Hopefully we'll run through these. But anyway, I appreciated that back and forth, guys. So working from the third and the fourth items in the nest, we talked about the small boat activity, the Ukrainian small boat activity. That then morphed about 2 days later into reports of a landing. And the landing was... sorry, my system's being slow to respond. But anyway, the third item back in the nest is the thread that Exit put together on the landings, and their connection to the small boats and their engagement with the offshore oil rigs. And then the fourth item back in the nest is from our friend Marcus, who put together a great thread on these as well. So Exit, hopefully I'm coming through okay, because my system is kind of locking up. Would you mind saying a word or two about these landings based on your thread?
You bet I can. So the landings in Crimea, as Andrew said kind of earlier, it's really unclear exactly what happened there. There were definitely some Ukrainians that landed there. It was at first even a little bit confusing because it came exactly the day after the ships or the little boats were seen around the oil drilling rig out in the middle of the Black Sea. So at first it wasn't entirely clear what was going on there and if there really were two of them. We did subsequently have some reports from some of the Russian public basically just saying that there had been some shots fired and big booms and things like that. So that kind of confirmed it as being specifically two separate ones that we could track. Ukraine put out a fairly brief little summary about them saying that there were special units, they'd landed on the shore, they engaged in combat with the units of the occupier. But honestly, other than the video that came out of them actually hanging a flag, there wasn't a lot of real information of exactly what was done there. And I'm not sure that we can specifically tie it to the destruction of the S-400 system that was confirmed later in the day. More importantly, I think it just proves that Ukraine does have the ability to move around on the Black Sea much more than we may have been hearing about before, and much more than I'm sure Russia wants to see happening. And that, excuse me, sorry, that specifically just bodes well for what their capabilities are going forward, and that we should be watching for these types of attacks in the future, because it opens up the possibilities for what they can do on the Crimean Peninsula specifically, that they may not have the same reach with their weapons. And I believe you're back, Mr. Bond.
I am. And so for those of you who don't know, when you host, if you lose connection and then have to restart, you have 60 seconds to restart. And I managed to reconnect with like 2 seconds left. So, in the James Bond movie, whenever he diffuses the bomb with 2 seconds left, it always makes me feel like I'm...
Hey, Mr. Bond.
A little bit more.
You've now got that
Yes.
other glitch that happens to you that hadn't happened yet. So we'll see you in a few minutes. So the other notable thing that happened in that particular landing, there was also some footage coming out with them actually... You're back again. Go for it.
Yeah, am I coming through okay now?
You are.
Oh, great. I was just excitedly describing to you guys how when you reconnect as host and have 60 seconds, in that last instance, I managed to reconnect with 2 seconds left. So it's like in the James Bond movies when he defuses the bomb with 2 seconds left. It made me feel a little bit more like a spy. But getting 2 glitches in a row is probably the universe telling me to wrap up because we're like 20 minutes over. So I can't just wrap up like that. We are in the middle of the Black Sea update. Maybe we won't finish it. What I'll do is, since these landing events, we got to hear Exit's explanation of them. They're super interesting. Those happened a few days ago. So it's good that we at least got to discuss them. The other fairly timely things that we may not have time to get to, there are a couple more points on the Black Sea, and then there are some updates on the Wagner front. So what I'm going to do is put the blocks of these other points up in the nest just so you can see them. I'm not going to spend much time on them at all. But I put some effort into getting the material together. So I do want to just highlight them quickly. So on the Black Sea front, if you were to have a look at the first 3 items in the nest now, you'll see that first item speaks to essentially shipping in the Black Sea, including that the Lady R, which is a cargo ship that transits Russian arms, it was denied entry to the Suez. I don't know the whole story there. Why it was denied entry, it's something I'd like to dig into. If you happen to know, please feel free to DM me some sources. That would be great. Erdogan endorsed the idea that Crimea is Ukraine. We see that shipments of oil, of Russian oil via the Black Sea are starting to decline a little bit, which is something we had anticipated as costs go up due to concerns about risk. There were reports that the Russians are using flooded ferries to protect the Kerch Bridge, like as in literal barriers that they are sinking in front of it. Again, this is one I wasn't able to dig into fully in order to understand it. So I don't know the scope of that. I don't know if those are intended to be permanent barriers, but that was, in order to prevent or reduce the likelihood of a repeat of the USV attack that happened most recently. And then finally in that item was just the announcement that Primus, which is the second ship to have exited Odessa, had reached NATO waters. Exit made reference to that earlier. So that's now 2 ships that have taken that new sort of humanitarian corridor. But there is hope that in addition to, humanitarian departures, it may ultimately be used for grain exports as well. Go ahead, Exit.
Just really quick, Erdogan has been pretty steadfast on saying that Crimea is Ukraine. He has said that since 2014 and hasn't really changed his stance on that. So people are reporting it as if it's new, but it's not really. The flooded ferries, when I looked into that, apparently the idea is that they're going to sink like 13 of them, I think is the right number. But they are there to be essentially holds, they're going to put some of the booms out like we've seen outside of Sevastopol. And they're supposed to be the anchors for the booms was the story that I heard. But by all means, if anybody has some correcting information on that or there's more to that story, I would love to hear it as well.
Yep. So again, pass us any info on that. The first item in the nest is just about grain shipments. The first was an investigation. It's a collaboration between Bellingcat and Lloyd's, the insurance company, to track Russian stolen grain exports. This is a question Exit used to receive pretty regularly about, is anybody tracking this? Now, at this point, I don't think anybody has a comprehensive list because they can't go back retroactively. But there is apparently now a team of joint sort of OSINT insurance shipping folks who are looking at it pretty closely. So that's terrific that that's a new initiative that's underway. There were reports that Ukrainian grain shipments out of the Danube are slowing somewhat. This is after the ports of Reni and Izmail appear to have been attacked by drones now, 2 or 3 times. And there were worries about how much would it affect shippers' willingness to engage, how much infrastructure is being affected. It does look like shipments are slowing slightly as a result. I also wanted to highlight that Exit did her last post on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the last delivery of the last grain ship, which, is a big deal. Exit had been working on that a long time. I just wanted to, acknowledge all the work that she put in on that, and that, that's a significant thing after having worked on it for almost a year, or I think just over a year. But then I say, is that the last BSGI delivery, or is it? Because you'll see that there are now speculation that this new route that runs through NATO waters, there are some proposing that it could be used for the export of grain. But how that plan will work specifically, who is for it, who is against it, we don't have a ton of insight into. And it's something I'm sure we'll cover in future spaces, so maybe we won't dwell on it too long now. The third item in the nest is the strike on the S-400 radar. The only reason I'm including it here is because there was a claim, and by here I mean in connection with the Black Sea, is because the landing on Crimea by the Russian Special Forces, people aren't sure what they did there. Could it have been recon? Could it have been in connection with this? It's possible. We just don't know. And then the other connection to the Black Sea is multiple reports now that S-400 system was struck by a Neptune, right, which is a modified anti-ship missile. Interesting claim that it's being used in a ground attack role. And, it now makes you wonder what other uses may be found for the Neptune. Two items at the bottom of this, which again, I think is the third in the nest, starts with the phrase Neptune used in S-400 strike. The two items at the bottom, interesting statistics that apparently 60 to 70% of all of the unmanned surface vessels that Ukraine has used have been intercepted without hitting targets. Just interesting to get some numbers on that. Of course, the high value of their targets, Russian naval ships, means that even if 10%, 20% get through and do damage to Russian ships, that's a huge return on the effort involved. And so just because 60 or 70 are intercepted doesn't mean that it's a failure. It's interesting to see the numbers. Last point in that block, there is a link to a Defense Express article speaking to the fact, so Zelensky was giving out awards, and he made reference to a new special brigade, and that was the first inkling that Ukraine has now set up a new brigade just for the purposes of unmanned surface vessel operations. So there's now a drone boat brigade in Ukraine, which would probably make it the first in a military anywhere in the world, which is an interesting update. I think that's it for the Black Sea. I think it is. I'm not going to speak to this in any length, but just so you can see it, I will put up the material I developed for Wagner, and I'll just explain what the blocks are in case you want to dive into the agenda to do any reading on your own. So the first, I think that should have worked out the way I expected it to, in terms of seeding it in the nest. Yeah, I think so. Hold on one moment. So anyway, the first block is on evidence. It includes the fact that Prigozhin was confirmed to have died based on DNA analysis. It then goes into speculation about who the new Wagner leader will be. There were some elements that came out that said after a meeting of the Wagner leadership that a new leader had been appointed, but then others who are close observers questioned whether this named individual actually had the respect and resources in the organization to be leader. That individual's name is Elizarov, and so that should be at the front of the nest in just a moment. Just want to make sure it actually gets there. Yeah, sorry, it's just not coming up. Anyway, I'm sorry for that. Hopefully it will pop up in a moment. What is the first tweet in the nest goes to, or excuse me, yeah, it came up. Now we're good. So that's the first tweet I just spoke to. The second tweet in the nest is the fact that they found greater evidence of the wreckage. And so that includes having discovered the black box, the fact that they found the wing. There's a tweet in there from OSINT Technical about the poor evidence handling of the Russians. So their ability to determine forensically what happened might be low. And given that we have to take for granted whatever they discover on the black box, means that this may be one of those mysteries where we don't get an answer for months and months. And we'll just have to live with that level of uncertainty, unfortunately. So that goes to the evidence on the crash. There were also claims that there was a part of the plane that was replaced. A special part was ordered from abroad, but there are now reports that that foreign ordered part was decided not to be used, and for some reason a local part was used instead. And some people are looking at that saying, well, why would they not use the more expensive foreign part? Perhaps this is a venue by which, you know, an explosive device could have been smuggled on board. But again, like they're looking at opportunity and not at any specific evidence. Go ahead, Exit, and then I'll wrap it up.
I was just going to say that there's so much misinformation that always comes out of Russia to begin with that a lot of this stuff on the plane crash in general, I figure a couple tablespoons of salt is probably a good thing to take it with, because I mean, at this point, the Russian government could say kind of anything they wanted, and I'm not sure that any of us, without an independent investigation, or maybe even with an independent investigation, would actually know what the truth is. It seems to be well hidden by most. There's the opportunity for it to be well hidden. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. Last points. This third tweet in the nest speaks to some claims about Prigozhin and how tight his security was, that it's lackluster. There are mixed reactions. There were some Wagner interviews in this tweet. The article from Medusa contains those. Essentially, the Wagner fighters saying that Prigozhin got lazy. He wasn't following security protocols. He was not supposed to be traveling on the same plane with Utkin, so those were all ignored. But that's in contrast with the next item down, which is the article from, I think, the Wall Street Journal, John Hudson, who highlights that Prigozhin was paranoid and had high security protocols. So it's not. I would tend to believe the Wagner fighters over the Western reporting on that front, but that's opinion. Also in that block, there was speculation that Wagner may have automatic protocols about steps to take in the event of Prigozhin's death. But Tatiana Stanovaya, who is a close observer of Russian politics, she found there was an interview with the Wagner fighter Anton Mardasov, who said that, sure, there were some protocols in place, but essentially they relied on the continued leadership of continuity and some leadership. And it's not just Prigozhin who died here, it's several other people. So that, to my eye, undermines the claim that Wagner, is prepared to take any specific steps at this point. It sounds like the scope of the loss of leadership may preclude that. And then in this block, last point, interesting that as people work through who all the passengers were, Christo Grozev of Bellingcat did some interesting work to run a name through. The name on the log wasn't coming up with great results. Slight misspelling, apparently. Bellingcat used some facial recognition software to confirm that that individual was actually Prigozhin's bodyguard, which, on top of the DNA analysis, adds additional context to suggest that Prigozhin was on the flight if his bodyguard was. Then the fourth item back, the last block, goes to impacts in Belarus, including some comments from Lukashenko, both saying that he warned Prigozhin about a potential earlier assassination attempt, trying to suggest he, was a friend of his. Also saying, there's no way that the Kremlin was involved in this because it was such a ham-handed assassination attempt, which sounds like a bit of a backhanded insult, as in backing up the Kremlin's claim, but at the same time saying that it was badly executed. So that's an interesting spin he put on it. Lukashenko also went on to say that his plan is that Wagner will remain in Belarus, but it's not clear, who he can work with as leadership in Wagner, or why Lukashenko would be interested in continuing to have Wagner in Belarus, whether it's just cheap training or whether there's some political goal of his. Anyway, and there are 2 or 3 other tweets there about the implications for the internal domestic politics of Belarus, of Wagner withdrawing from them. And so thanks for bearing with me. Again, I put a bunch of time into preparing that material, and I dislike when we just don't have a chance to get to it. And I'll note that there's a whole additional part to the agenda that goes into cyber matters, espionage matters, diplomacy, and the like. So again, I would suggest you consider taking that away as reading, because I think there are lots of great items in there that don't get the coverage that they deserve. With that, I'll wrap up. I've added to the front of the nest the link to our next discussion so that you can set your reminder now. Again, I hold these talks every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time and every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So our next talk will be on Thursday at 9, and I hope you guys can join us. And so I'll say thanks for dropping by to listen. I think it was a great discussion. We had Ryan Hendrickson on to provide lots of info on the work his organization does in demining. It sounds like a great project. If you missed the talk, do go to his profile. It's Tip of the Spear 42, and there are links to it in the invite to today's space to consider supporting him. And I'd like to say thank you to everybody who came up to speak. I would encourage you to go to the profiles of our speakers. They've been working on these events since the beginning of the war. I think they're all worth a follow. And finally, I'd like to thank my co-hosts, Exit and Andrew. We ran a little over time. I appreciate you guys sticking with me, and you had some terrific insight to add to the conversation today. Without your help, it would be extremely hard to hold these spaces. And so with that, I hope to see you guys on Thursday, and have a great night.